Welcome to the Lead Wasps Podcast, the only podcast in the world that specifically hosts international infantry guests. This week your guest is Heston Russell, a former major from 2 Commando Regiment in the Australian Army. Some of the footage you're about to see is from his deployments fighting in Afghanistan and his organisation Voice of a Veteran. Use it to prime your mind for the discussion you're about to hear. And without further ado, the Lead Wasps Podcast, episode 36, is live.
Looking for adventure, serving your country. Either way, as soon as you join the military, you're given a purpose outside of yourself. You're taught to have whatever is motivating you, whatever is fatiguing you, to not be any matter before the mission or the men that you're there to support. First and foremost, contemporary veterans need to be helped tomorrow. So getting out there and saying, hey, there's some contemporary veterans who are taking up the cause for you and want to involve you with it, that's step one, to know that, hey, someone's out there listening. Because when I was sitting on my couch and you having your moments, mate, you felt like that you're waiting for Big Brother, you're waiting for the system to fix it, but it's not going to happen. So we need to start helping our guys and girls, our peers tomorrow.
But yeah, Heston Russell, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with me. I know you're on the other side of the world and it's you're a very busy man at the minute, so I really do appreciate it, and I know the boys will be pumped to hear what you've got to say. But we'll kick in with the opener, and that's basically you just telling a little story about something that you done while you're deployed or while you're in the army, about something that you done that you didn't want anyone to know about, but you're more than happy to admit to now. So fire away.
Hey mate, thanks so much for having me on for starters. Oh, that's a tough one. You know what? I'm going to go against the norm, and it was actually my very first deployment back in my rifle company infantry days. I was platoon commander with 2R over in East Timor, 2007, 2008, and old mate Alfredo Ronaldo had just done his assassination attempt on the Prime Minister and President, and I was fortunate enough to be the QRF platoon commander. And that was actually the first helo assault force I did up onto a Mount Kaikasa in Timor. And it was the wariest thing I'd ever done as a first-year infantry platoon commander. And I remember we landed in helicopters onto this village, and the guys went straight to their target compounds. And I was there with my SIG, and next thing I heard something making a big noise behind one of these buildings. So I had my F-88 Old Star up to my shoulder. You know, I was doing everything that I'd seen in the movies beforehand, and I put my safety catch to instant. The noise got louder. The next thing, something rushed out at me. And I literally took up the first trigger finger depression on my styer as this giant pig ran out of me. I'd been ambushed by a pig, mate, and no one knew it except for my SIG. And there were no shots fired. That entire deployment. But to this day, my SIG's kept his mouth shut. But I caught up with him recently, actually just a few years ago, and he's like, I just remember, boss, I was there when you almost shot a pig, and almost this only shots fired our entire deployment. I was like, thanks, man. I fired a few more since then, but imagine that. Imagine if I had actually shot a pig.
Fuck, that would have been good crack in a battalion, wouldn't it? If you were the only one to get rounds down range.
You could just imagine, it was obviously it's a peacekeeping deployment, and that would have been one of the first shots fired that would have had all these incident reports gone out through all forms of strategic command level. That Lieutenant Russell had fired his weapon and killed a pig.
Jeez, that's a good one. And I'm sure that set you up good for later in life, while you're deployed in Afghanistan with those fucking bear dogs.
Unfortunately, that's an even interesting story. You know, when we were in Afghanistan, there's definitely a lot of dogs that we did actually have to shoot. You know, they were big bloody things.
Yeah.
The last I once had one of my soldiers in Timor actually got bitten by a dog and had to go through all the tetanus boosters and shots, and it just removed him from operational capabilities, you can imagine. But I now have, and he's probably going to come in and crash this party in a minute, and almost, he's just over 1.5-year-old mini dachshund sausage dog. And I actually was watching back some of my old cam footage the other day where I got off and shot a dog, and I was like, if someone came here and shot my dog, you'd have a new generation of insurgents on your hands.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, I mean,
there's a new level of empathy.
For people who don't know, just describe what a fucking bear dog is.
Oh, they're like, mate, they're, up a picture like a greyhound. If anyone's ever seen those ex-racing greyhounds, like they're big bloody things, but they're hairy, they're mangy, and they look like if they bite you, it's toxic, like your leg's going to fall off. And they're not afraid to come at you. And they're also quite decisive when they decide they're going to go at you. So, it's like being charged by a bear, absolutely correct. But, particularly the biggest issue is once you get tetanus or rabies or the threat thereof, the needles in the stomach and all sorts of stuff are far worse than the bite itself.
Yeah, and not only that, they're almost always chained up at the entrance to a target or a building or whatever, as a form of protection for the people.
They are the early warning device.
There, yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
But fuck, man, the last thing you want to do is get bitten by one of those. Like you said, you think your leg's going to fall off. But if you don't mind, just give the listeners and the viewers a brief introduction as to who you are.
Sure. So obviously my name's Heston Russell. I joined the Army straight out of high school. I'm obviously here in Australia, and I went to the Australian Defence Force Academy, which is where we train to become an officer. And I joined Army 3 years and then 1 year at our Royal Military College. And then I graduated as a lieutenant up to our Townsville, our 2nd Battalion, which is a light infantry battalion. I spent 3 years up there, including a deployment to East Timor. And then as the DFSW, or anti-armoured platoon commander, which is actually when we brought the sustained fire machine gun 50 cals into service and had the javelins and stuff like that. So that was cool. Then 2010, when I got promoted to captain, I went down to our 2nd Commando Regiment, which is our East Coast based, Sydney based Special Forces unit. And I pretty much spent the majority of my career there, which included domestic counterterrorism duties, 4 deployments to Afghanistan, including protective security detachment, taking our first female Prime Minister over to Afghanistan as my first trip, through to then Special Operations Task Group Rotation 18. We did something like 67 missions, 120, killed 120 insurgents, captured over 200 more, lost one of my best soldiers, Corporal Scott Smith, to IED in Helmand, and then spent a few years bopping around Asia Pacific as per the Australian priorities to conduct our operational preparation and international engagement in countries like Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, Fiji, Thailand. Then adjutant, then got deployed for a year on exchange to the US Special Forces, including their Rangers, and another deployment overseas with their classified task force. Came back, ran our remodeled and ran our Special Forces selection course for commandos and support staff for about 18 months. And then the end of my career, finished up my last deployment as deployed to Iraq as the Special Operations J5, or Joint Planner. At that time, it was fighting Daesh, fighting ISIS. And it was in the final throes of Mosul. So that was end of 2016, start of 2017. And then got back, long service leave, got out, and here I am now. And my primary focus at the moment is supporting veterans with my brand voiceofaveteran.org, and advocating for veterans, particularly in a space whereby we're going through a few interesting pieces here in the Australian media and the Australian defence culture.
Yeah, damn, that's a long and distinguished list. Did you ever think that when you were a kid that you would ever have anything like that?
Well, I didn't. And I think as per all of us on here, I was extremely privileged with having a fantastic career and fantastic life experience. And I was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time for a number of those opportunities that I worked very hard for and made sure I was prepared for where they came along. But, as we all know, mate, and this is a big part in our veteran community at the moment, I meet so many veterans who sit there and go, oh, I never deployed anywhere, I never did anything. But, I signed up to serve. And then along the way came service that gave me a fantastic career. And as long as I worked hard at it, I was able to reap the benefits and learn from those. So to answer your question, absolutely not. I wouldn't change a single thing. And I'm so happy with who I am now and today. But now the responsibility is on me to put that to use instead of sitting there and telling people to buy me a beer every Anzac Day.
Fucking hell. That's something I never want to encounter, and I'm glad we live in the UK where people don't buy you a brute on Veterans Day or whatever. So it's kind of, no one really, I don't think the public really gives a fuck, to be fair here, but it is what it is. I wouldn't really have it any other way. I don't want plaudits or that, but
Yep.
What was life like growing up for you as a kid then? Because outside of Australia, there's this stereotypical idea that kids grow up fucking chasing snakes and fighting kangaroos. Is that what it was like for you?
Maybe a little bit. No. My dad was actually in the army. He joined as a soldier in artillery, became a bombardier, and then became an officer. And he spent the majority of his career in our parachute infantry battalion, and he was a free fall instructor and all that. So I grew up with a couple of postings, including to the US as a kid and in and around a few states, and always in and around army families and friends. And then my mother's side of the family, her father, my grandfather, he just passed away this last December, but he was a section commander and then a platoon sergeant on the Hook in Korea.
Oh, damn.
And then he was then he was the regimental sergeant major of one of our infantry battalions, 8 RAR in Vietnam. And he never really spoke to me about that until his later years. But so the military was always in and around me, and I knew from an early age it's what I wanted to do. But I, born in Sydney, grew up in the suburbs of Brisbane. Yeah. Not many snakes, not many kangaroos, plenty of urban jungle, but yeah, that's about it.
And so I guess you're inspired completely by your family to join the army and go down that line of work.
Yeah, I think I definitely got to see, when I was a kid, being in the army was things like going onto the base for obstacle course days with another mate, and you had like an egg in an ammo crate that you couldn't crack to get through the obstacle course. And you were doing things like mill flotation and watercraft, and it was a very, you'd block off the street with wheelie bins and play cricket. It was a fantastic community, and particularly then as I moved out of that, Dad got out of the army when I was in about grade 4 when we moved up to Brisbane. I was about 11, was that 9 years old? You look back on those fond childhood memories and remember that community. And then some of the inspirational people that still remained in my life, some of the children of those other defence families who are a bit older than me, became sort of role models and essentially forward scouts. So I got to watch them go. And one of those in particular did the officer training and went to the commandos. And I basically had these exact role models that I got to follow their career path. So it stuck with me early from fun, emotional investment as a kid within that community, and then continued with, particularly your impressionable teenage years, watching someone and some people that you look up to do what you want to do, combined with what I think most guys and girls also go through. Honestly, where I grew up here, I hated high school. I didn't have the most enjoyable time there, and there's not much opportunity around here apart from the normal cookie cutter style employment. So I definitely was someone who wanted some adventure, wanted some change, wanted to get out of home and do all that. And c'est la vie, that's what the military provides.
Yeah. What year was it when you were leaving school then? Was it post 9/11?
Yeah, 2012. I was talking about 2002.
Right.
Yeah, 2002. So you're right.
And what was Australia's military footing, looking like around the globe? As an 18-year-old, what was your understanding of Australia's military? How many fingers did they have in pies at that time?
Yeah, for sure. I think East Timor had definitely kicked off for us as well. I'd really seen the large military push around. We had the year 2000 Olympic Games here as well, where I got to see, military uniform and involvement there. And then absolutely the war on terror was off and running. And the key part was, I don't think for me, I didn't join up specifically for that. Even throughout all my life, I've sort of battled with imposter syndrome and things like that. So I definitely wasn't ahead of myself thinking that I was joining in order to do that. I actually joined because I wanted to be a commando. That was my primary purpose, was to be a commando. And it actually came from a place of wanting to test myself to be the best, but also just knowing that I would finally receive like the highest level of investment and training to either test me to become my best, or, leave me wanting and leave me with things that I needed to improve upon.
Yeah. In terms of East Timor, then, what is that? What was that conflict look like, or what is the mission there? Because it's something that sure. I personally don't really know much about.
No, good. So East Timor is now called Timor-Leste, but back then it was East Timor. Was a province of Indonesia that basically wanted to have their own independence and ended up being suppressed by the Indonesians physically, through use of force and deployed military forces. A number of massacres occurred, and they actually voted for and were successful in voting for their independence, which then sparked a large reaction from Indonesia, including the deployment of military forces against them and some more massacres and stuff. And that saw Australia intervene. So Australia led the contingent into East Timor in essentially what was a peacemaking phase of operations. And I don't honestly know the years off the top of my head. My military history for Timor has been overtaken by my military history for Afghanistan and Iraq. So the early years were peacemaking. I know I had one of my cousins and some other friends deploy to that period, where it was active patrols, restoring security, ensuring that Indonesia was respecting the border and the independence of the country. And then by the time I got over there, it was peacemaking. As you can imagine, as a part of regular developing country culture and ecosystems, particularly when there was that very hardcore attrition that occurred, and then the vacuum once that was removed, including local gangs and stuff rising up. That sort of power vacuum where people start to jockey for some positioning and taking out some old grievances. So we spent the majority of my time over there conducting weapon sweeps with the United Nations to try and recover any remaining things like hand grenades, bloody sharpened darts, bolt action rifles, all things that shouldn't be on your local home block. But it was mainly protecting them from each other, protecting weaker from stronger, things like that. But I tell you what, mate, as far as like a first deployment as a 22-year-old young platoon commander, and I always had a pretty young platoon, it was fantastic. Those peacekeeping missions were far more consuming as far as their emotional intelligence requirements. There wasn't risk, there wasn't threat. Like I said, like even putting your weapon to instant was a big move and a big decision.
Yeah.
So I spent, every Thursday, myself and my SIG would go down to the local village and teach English to the kids. Been fortunate enough to learn Indonesian during my 3 years at the Defence Force Academy, through to you'd go and, we had our own platoon fighting chicken that was maintained at the next village and go down every week to conduct engagement and watch our poor chook get his head kicked in, but we'd feed him doxy pills and he would recover pretty quick. And
was he was he an Australian chicken, or was he one that you molded from the Indonesians?
We sponsored this chicken that was maintained by the local stable. But just that integrating with that civilian community, mate, even getting bloody notebooks and crayons and stuff sent over and sitting down with the kids, and it was fantastic. I joined to be a big tough commando, but my time in Timor was such a pivotal part in my life to appreciate that true hearts and minds piece, particularly when there's no threat. It was so easy to become jaded by not doing what we'd been trained and developed to do at the pinnacle. But I was there, I was learning life skills, and I had responsibilities and authorities that were literally helping to shape the lives of, things like kids and those who literally couldn't provide for themselves. It was, at 22, it was fantastic. And I got to do it with 30 guys who were forcing me to be the best I could personally and professionally. So,
I mean, it's interesting you pick up that point about engaging with locals and trying to help people, because I think that generally is, if you're infantry, you're the face of the army, you're the face of the mission pretty much, because you are the one that is going to be engaging with, people out on patrol day in, day out. And, I think that gets forgotten, in the general overlook when you look back on conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq. Like almost all of the time is not doing much. It is engaging with locals, and it is like giving fucking kids pens and chocolates and, like teaching them fucking naughty phrases in English or whatever like that. But it's like, it's the engagement, which is, most of the time on patrol. And then, every, I would say about 5-10% of the time, you're engaged in, contact or whatever, or you're in a cordon for an ID. But even still, then kids are coming up to you while you're sat in a cordon for 4 hours, like try to fucking steal your antenna or whatever it might be. I don't know, but it's like these people have got lasting memories of your face and your time that you spent engaging with them, and like like that, I think that gets forgotten because everyone always wants to just hear the fucking the war stories about kicking doors in and, you know, fucking getting people with a bayonet or whatever like that. But I mean, that's cool. That's Ali. But yeah, the softer side of war almost kind of gets forgotten a lot.
Absolutely, man. And only now, after doing a lot more and experiencing a lot more and seeing the ramifications of a lot more, do I truly appreciate that operational preparation environment actually spans generations. And, you know, we look there to identify and create and foster strong links with those key personnel within the community or within the government or whatever. But, you know, the more of a lasting impact that you actually have an emotional impression on the young generation, on those kids, you know, I openly look forward to and had planned to do before COVID got in the way, just, you know, as a part of my own little sort of self-recovery and discovery over the last year of craziness, to actually go back to Dili in Timor-Leste and actually go back to some of those villages. And, you know, those kids, that was 2007, you know, there's 13 years now. Some of those kids are going to be like in their 20s, mate. Yeah. And, you know, you remember, like I was saying to you beforehand, as far as a lot of the reasons why I joined the military myself, that emotional impressionability as a young one. You know, the way in which we conduct ourselves, particularly those little ones, they're the ones who are literally the most vulnerable to be able to either form bad opinions or good opinions. And they do so on an emotive level. It's the way they feel, not the way they think. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. And the best part about most Western countries, don't know about you Scots, but at least for us over here, is that most kids like us and we're pretty good engaging with kids. But,
no, you get it. Come on. You know the Scots are the most liked in the world, right?
Oh, is that because the kids run and pull your skirts up, is it? I'm kidding. Oh, man. I'm kidding, mate. Oh, no doubt. They're probably sitting there trying to understand what you're saying. I get it.
Yeah. You'll have that struggle as well with fucking English and American dudes, right? It's like, what the hell are you saying? Mate. Like, you talking English? Fucking hell, bro. So you joined the army and you ended up going down the officer route, and part of that is going to the Royal Military College in Duntroon. So whereabouts is that? What does it look like? And
good. Yeah,
and for sure. So is it essentially like the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst? Is it essentially the same thing?
For sure, it's taken off. I mean, everything here in Australia is taken off the British model as far as our training and education regime. So our Defence Force Academy, where I went for 3 years, is a mixture. It's a tri-service academy, Army, Air Force and Navy. And that is where you conduct a degree. So it's a university campus, but it's wearing uniforms every day, drill 3 times a week. And then instead of having university holidays, you conduct military training blocks, you go bush. And then if you do 3 years at ADFA, you only then do 1 year at the Royal Military College. Or you can go straight into the Royal Military College and not get a degree and do ADFA. And then you have to do 18 months. So they're both located in Canberra and they're both literally over different sides of the hill. Right. So when you graduate from ADFA, you march over the hill to RMC, and the Royal Military College is an all Army academy, and every person in the military who receives a commission, in the Army who receives a commission, goes through the Royal Military College. And you can imagine it's professional military education, it's PT, it's all those good things. And you go through 3rd, 2nd and 1st class and come out at the rank of lieutenant. Do you guys call it lieutenant or lieutenant?
Well, when you finish Sandhurst, it'll be 2nd lieutenant.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, see, we come out as a full lieutenant, so 2 pips.
So 2nd lieutenant over here is 2 pips, and then lieutenant's 1 pip, and then captain's 3. Kind of weird.
Wow. There you go.
Yeah. So how was your time there? And do you have any highlights that you look back on and have some fond memories?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. ADFA was fun. ADFA is what I needed. I was not an exemplary cadet, but I got to, I did the degree we call Army Rugby Arts. So I did an arts degree. I played lots of rugby and I was good at the Army bush stuff. But and ADFA was fun for getting me used to being an adult. And then RMC, the Royal Military College, was fantastic for getting me into the green. Because to be honest, I really didn't enjoy the studying part. Again, getting the language was great. Learning how to write essays and all that was great, but I was never really that bad at school. I just didn't enjoy it. And then Royal Military College, you finally got to, be tested and trained in leadership, and everything was very tangible and obvious as to what it was required for and its practical application. we're working towards honing ourselves in military craft. And I love that. And there was such a heavy focus on sports and, competitions like obstacle courses. There was a large physical component to it. And I'd always been very physically gifted as far as like athletics and rugby and gym and strength and stuff like that. And I was truly tested by others. And it was that, that environment where everyone, when they had downtime, was going to the gym. And it was a really, really positive, energizing environment, challenging at the same time, lots of new things. And you're being forced to demonstrate leadership and be exposed and have to be, authentic. So I loved it, and to this date and throughout my career, when the opportunity arose, I loved going back to the Royal Military College, even last year, to conduct, leadership presentations to them from missions and stuff like that, because that is just, so impressionable, but such a pivotal point in everyone's life. You can imagine you're setting the individual leadership ethos and culture of people from the start. So I have nothing but good memories. However, Canberra, I know I'm saying this to the international Northern Hemisphere audience, is bloody cold. It is too cold for me. The first bush trip I went down there at ADFA, I remember eating a beef Kai Si Ming ration pack that made me feel ill, and I threw up. And in the morning, I was scraping off a chunk of orange frozen solid Kai Si Ming off my webbing and snapping it off my hoochie. It was that cold, and I don't like the cold period. So,
did you ever deploy to Afghan in the winter?
Yeah, I actually rotated out before winter. I was there for one winter. Yeah, but mate, you're doing it with puff jackets, and you're doing it. By that time, I was well entrenched in the special forces, and my equipment resembled anything but tactical over comfort. So, when Canberra's not cold, mate, it is so hot during the day, and the flies that come out down there, Canberra's just.
I heard that before. I think it was Rob Langdon. He was telling me the same thing about Australia just being fucking covered with flies.
Canberra definitely is. I mean, look, Canberra is our nation's capital. They carved out of a state and put it the furthest away from. It's the furthest capital city we have away from any actual sea. We're all on the coastline. They've got a big bloody lake out there that's probably got too many dead bodies buried in it. I don't know, but Canberra's not for me. It's also like all politicians and all senior military hierarchy. So, whereas when I would deploy up to Townsville, you could go out, get locked up, get in trouble, and all the cops might know you. You do that in Canberra, you're going to be, punching on with the Prime Minister's son or daughter, or, something terrible that's going to get you on the national news. So you just couldn't step out of line.
Yeah. In terms of finishing up at the RMC then, what was your mindset about rocking up to your unit as a new platoon commander?
I was very fortunate. You really go into competition for which unit you want to go to. And that time, when you go to select your corps and select your units, you were sort of selecting what we were guessing was going to be the next operational cycle. And this time we had infantry battalions deploying to security detachments in Iraq, also to Afghanistan in smaller numbers, and then to East Timor. So I definitely want to go up to, I actually thought that 2R was going to be going to Afghanistan first. So I deployed up there, and it did, but it was in different elements. And the largest deployment was the battle group deployments was to East Timor. So that's what ended up. But I always wanted Townsville because I grew up here in Brisbane, which is where most of our other battalions were, or the ones that were going to be deploying. And I didn't want to be where I'd grown up. I wanted, again, that complete cutaway. And a lot of anticipation. I mean, up in Townsville, up north is, again, it's light infantry. So there's no vehicles. The vehicles were down here in Brizzy. It's hot, like it's tropics. And again, I don't want to talk too much in hindsight, noting we're talking about me with anticipation going there. I was fortunate enough to be going there with a couple of guys that I also knew from my class, but there were definitely nerves, and you don't know what to expect. And that was the first real big plunge into, having real live soldiers, not leading your fellow classmates and stuff. And yeah, it was interesting. Yeah. I've never really taken the time to think back over it. This is the first time I've really done that in a long, long time. Yeah.
And when you went to the college, then were you already tracking an infantry route, or was that something that came later on throughout that time at college?
So
Kind of
when
going
I
back
was
a little bit.
when I was 16 years old or 15 years old, I attended my first recruitment seminar here in Brisbane, and I knew going in there that I want to be a commando. So I turned up and I said I want to be a commando, and the guy chuckled. I think it was a corporal on the front. He said, "It's admirable. There's a few steps in between." So that's when he, told me you can go the officer route through ADF, or you can go the direct. We didn't have direct recruitment. You had to go through regular army. So either way, I knew it was a 3 to 4 year cycle. But I knew that at that time, commando was an infantry an infantry unit in itself. So it was obviously more relevant for me to go the infantry stream. And my dad was infantry. My grandfather was infantry.
Yeah.
Well, my dad started artillery, but was in infantry. So that's what I wanted to do. Yeah.
And what was life?
Well, back then, infantry were the ones who were doing the real work.
Yeah.
What
was life like as a young platoon commander with 2 RAR then, when you eventually did get there and kind of get settled in? Was it a tough job, or was it something that you found you kind of took in your tracks pretty easy?
It was pretty awesome. Like, I was definitely pretty prepared for it, and I think a key part of the benefit with me was actually I still probably doubted myself a little bit internally, not externally. So I definitely took the time to engage with my platoon sergeant and my section commanders. I had some very experienced dudes. I also had, at that time, Bravo Company actually had a brand new bunch of new soldiers come in. So most of where you might encounter, angry NCOs dealing with the young Jube officer, a lot of their time was spent being angry with the young Jube soldiers. So I sort of got to, as long as I was doing my job pretty well, I got to learn pretty fast. And my key strength in anything to do with military is and even these days, I'm a very fast learner. And so I'm able to really get in there and just shut up for the first few weeks and sit there and watch. And you can imagine marching into a new unit, there's enough stuff you have to do yourself to get yourself sorted. And as long as you're keeping your eyes and your ears open along the way. And it was just, really organically growing with that. And to be honest, mate, the worst part about actually joining the battalion as a new platoon commander was actually the other more senior junior officers. Like, there was, back in those days, there was this culture whereby, there were bullies, mate. There were genuine bullies from these older dudes who were like the senior lieutenants, and not so much the captains, it was in the lieutenant ranks who were, 2-3 years ahead of you. And I don't know if they had a chip in their shoulder. I've run into a few of them since then, and I just couldn't really care about it. But there was definitely this look to establish this own internal hierarchy. And, there was the similar back at the Royal Military College and Defence Force Academy with the hierarchy being your years. But for me, I was always really so adamant that, your competence and character, your performance and your personality were those key definitions. And, there's definitely a level of respect you have to afford to people who are senior to you in time and position. But I'm sure, as all of us these days who've actually served the military know, that just because you've been somewhere for longer doesn't mean you're better at it.
Yeah.
It might mean that it takes longer to do that, mate, And to going into an attitude of entitlement, given anything other than daily renewable performance, is already a character trait and a leadership quality that I can and never will connect with. And I see that as someone being a bully. And the best part about my entire defence career in hindsight was my ability to travel around the world and take the fights to bullies and support those who were being bullied. So I actually really hated that first year in the battalion as a young officer because of some of the other officers who were just bullies. And to be honest, as opposed to actually getting in fights with a few of them, which there were some argy-bargy, I just actually disengaged from that. And I just engaged so much more with my platoon, my guys. And I actually started playing, rugby outside of the base and my civvy guys. And then when some of those other guys moved on in the subsequent years, I took it upon myself to make sure that the next lieutenants, the next young officers coming through never had that happen to them. And that, my last year, third year as a lieutenant, I became senior subaltern, the senior subby, which is this sort of unofficial official position. Yeah. And then finally I got to achieve my sort of cultural takeover, and that never happened again from that point forward. But also, army culture shifted, but it was a really, really key lesson to learn from that really early age. Happens in the officer ranks too, mate. You know,
Yeah,
not just you
listen,
bloody.
I was just about to say it's so weird, but I don't know if that's a more societal thing. Does Australia have like a recognised kind of class structure? Because obviously in the UK that's a thing, right? You know, you've got people who inherit land and inherit property, and you know they're fucking born and bred with a silver spoon in their mouth. And I'm not saying that officers are like that in the UK, but you know, there's definitely the poorer class of society that end up joining infantry, and that's just general across the board. That's just a fact. You know, I wasn't rich. My old boy was in the army, and then I ended up leaning on my mum for, you know, and it was just me and her for a while, and she wasn't doing too great, you know, looking back on it now. So like, I never had privilege, and I think the guys who are coming through and who might have that, you know, that bully mentality, you know, they've just got away with it all their life. You know, they've just had that ability just to fucking press on people who they deem or you know inadequate to them, and you know what it is, and I've came to realize it is incompetence. They hide their incompetence and they hide their incapability to actually lead and actually have an understanding of what it does take to lead, you know, men.
Yep.
And you're told, you know, as you go through the ranks, you're told, like, especially the first rank as an NCO, you're told, oh, you need to separate yourself from the guys. And so, like, that becomes the focus for young NCOs, like, separating themselves rather than actually being a good leader. Like, oh, I'm not going to drink with the boys in the lines anymore. I'm going to make sure I'm being a cunt to them. And it only takes a couple of years for you. It takes a while for you to realize that that's not how it works. Like, you actually, the more investment you put into the boys, the more you drink in the lines with them, the more they'll respect you, the more they'll understand that you're actually a good leader. But you have to be a good leader at the same time. You can't just be bevying with them all the time or whatever. But do you think that's maybe the same case as, you know, for the situation you're describing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I 100% level with you, and I put it down to weak leadership. You know, the one thing that I am an expert is leadership and planning, only because that's all I was ever taught at every rank level and progression, and then had to master and teach to others. And being a leader is comprised of three things. It's authority, you know, the rank given to you, management, your ability to effectively manage resources, and leadership, your ability to motivate people. So the weakest form of leaders are those who rely on authority or perceptions of authority and wield it as entitlement as opposed to responsibility. And in this case, you know, they actually didn't have authority. It was perceived authority that came from time and rank or seniority in years as opposed to competence. And dovetailing into what you were talking about as far as like delineation of classes in Australia, probably not so much. I mean, looking back, I think I remember a few of those guys were, you know, private school boys, and my mum was an aerobics instructor. My dad was, again, worked his way from a soldier and went to officer training, but there was never really any of that. There was more so, you know, just pretty much because I've been there long enough, this is what I believe. And it's very interesting to note also your point talking about maintaining that separation from the guys. I'm a guy who, it also even comes from, you know, I wasn't a popular kid in bloody high school. I was overweight. I was like obese and like the fat kid at school, and I really never had friends. And that was probably one of the best part about the army, was that, you know, I was forced to be around people and people were forced to be in my team. But
I was a big fatty too at one point when I was a kid.
Oh, mate, the best ones are, you know, 72 hours on the man. That's where it's at. I had to maintain those barriers in order to, because I definitely sometimes I'm definitely all in, particularly when I like someone, and not like someone out of favoritism. But, you know, I really take a liking to someone when you just see that they are a tireless, a hard worker, they are the silent achiever, and they just are bubbling with potential. And also, you know, I was always very physically gifted as far as like being captain of the football team or like, you know, just very good in physical competitions and things. And you can imagine in the infantry people start really magnetizing to you, and you start hanging out with those guys at the gym and things like that. And I had to maintain buffers whereby I didn't go out and interact on the piss with the guys and things like that, only because I didn't yet have that emotional maturity to be able to cut off that emotion or that fondness in that and maintain that professional relationship afterwards, if that makes sense. Yeah. You know, I could sort of unfortunately wear my heart a little bit too much on my sleeve. And I even look back and remember being, you know, in the platoon office with some of the guys talking about one of the other platoon commanders and, you know, what do I think about this? And, you know, even saying like, hey guys, I think it's inappropriate to be having this conversation. And fast forward, you know, there's been plenty of nights where I've had some of my guys in a headlock, they've had me in a headlock. And particularly once we get into the much more kinetic years of my military career, and getting on the piss with your guys is actually a very intelligent decompression hyperdose of depressant, which is alcohol, in extremely anxious circumstances that are repetitious combat deployments. And there's actually that making yourself relatable and real to the guys, being vulnerable, not being weak with the guys. And that's all part of our own personal emotional maturity and develop that it is particularly for young officers who haven't had life experience before service, there is that requirement to maintain separation. But the key part is it's not to maintain status, or it's not to maintain authority. It's to maintain effectiveness and maintain a clear sight of leadership versus likability. But as my career culminated, I'm now out of the military, the best leaders are those that are liked, and not liked because they're good guys, but because they're good guys and they're good at their job. And that they will be better at their job as being good guys, and they appreciate that piece. And that's actually the hardest form of leadership. The weakest and easy form of leadership is to solely rely on your authority, or just to be friends with the guys. But being able to balance the two of them, appreciate we're all emotionally regulated, and actually tap into and harness those emotions and show your own in a controlled fashion that we call passion. Yeah. That's a much harder form of leadership, and it really takes a very special type of person to learn and develop that through trial and error.
Well, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything you just said there. One of the most
better, mate. You better, otherwise we're going to edit this out of the podcast, right?
Yeah, I definitely don't want this to be an echo chamber, but I do agree with everything you just said there. I almost we're all very similar minded, so we all fucking have the same thoughts, most likely. Yep. But one of the
good ones, the bad ones are just caught up in their own shit.
Yeah, one of the most public displays of like a leadership, type bonding event would be like our international rugby team getting together. I don't think it happens so much nowadays, but back in the day, like they would have like a friendly, and then they'd go out in the piss, or they'd have like a big piss up to start off like a training camp, and then they'd it's just to set the mood, set the scene, get everyone tracking about how this guy is, how they socially interact with each other, and how much they're actually willing to invest in the guys that they might not have met before or whatever, and that's one of the most public displays of like a bonding event that you get, because they all talk about it. They all openly discuss like going on tour, and how bonded they were when they came back from that. And it's the same as us, when you go on deployment, it's the same. You come back and you're like, the fucking boys you've just been on tour with is closer to you than like your own family. But obviously we're not getting big piss up sessions out in Afghan. Well, I don't know about you, but we weren't. But yeah, it's those times spent together, and like you mentioned as well, you become vulnerable with guys, and they see that you are actually a person that they can invest in you, rather than just taking what you're saying as a leader or an authoritarian and just doing the job as a bare minimum. They're more likely to invest more of their effort and time into trying to impress you and trying to produce the goods for you, rather than just doing it because you told them to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that emotional alignment to purpose, and to mission. And even getting on the piss, we talk about Dutch courage, and there are those who use getting on the piss as their opportunity to do crazy shit. But more so, it actually helps us to wear down and remove some of those layers that actually prevent us from showing some of that true emotion. And some of that emotion is that bromance, love, that mateship we talk about here in Australia, mate. And sometimes you just need those sessions to connect and engage. And it's just knowing when to draw the line is that hard thing. And I'll level with you. When we were on deployment to Afghanistan within Special Forces, we did have controlled drinking sessions. As a part of it, once a month, with the Bravos, the platoon sergeants, and the CSM would conduct like a lockdown of the lines, and you'd have designated servers. And it was more coordinated than any bloody professionally licensed nightclub as far as the control measures and weapons locked away and all that sort of good stuff. But when we lost a guy, or when we lost guys over there, we would do it. And it's looking back in hindsight, it's again, when you're on operational deployments and you're going outside the wire, we went outside the equivalent of every second day on our 5-month deployment. So 67 missions. And this was flying out to capture and kill people. It wasn't going on presence patrols. It was going into the thick of it, guys who quantified to have special forces sent after them, and we lost one of my guys to an IED, and he was our very best engineer, Jedi, special forces guys we'd ever met. And if, the most dangerous unseen risk could get him, we're living with those risks every day. And you're just building and feeding into this lifestyle of anticipation and potential fear. And it's more so that anxiety. You're literally building a lifestyle of anxiety. And as we all know, alcohol, mate, is a depressant.
Yeah.
Let alone the ability to have a supercharged boost of a depressant to help knock out some of that anxiety, and then to lower some of those potential barriers to allow you to actually express emotions that otherwise you're suppressing because you need to maintain your physical and mental resilience and alertness out there. When I speak to my grandfather, he told me the same thing about his time in Vietnam and Korea. And you know what? I say this to any of my officer mates or any of those generals who are like, the men shouldn't be drinking. It's a dry trip. The men should not be left to be drinking under their own provisions.
Yeah.
But if you do not appreciate that, like every other Western society does, the potential role that being able to allow people to feel some form of vulnerability, be that, consuming alcohol with their guys in a controlled fashion, then you're irrelevant. And you're just a bloody, as Alan Jones, one of our famous TV presenters here says, you're just a bloody start shirt sitting in an office. You need to get out there on the ground and get some relevance. And that's the issue for some of those people who have just become professional officers. And I say professional officers, and there's even professional senior NCOs and warrant officers, as opposed to leaders. You need to maintain your relevance to the ground. And that's just one very small single issue zealot topic I'm going to talk about. But, particularly with this podcast being for those guys in military, you sign up to work through it and suck it up and go through the shit. There are small little things that are actually beneficial and supportive to you. And as long as they're conducted with responsibility and non-entitlement per anything in our careers, they actually have the ability to be force multipliers and preserve the force, as opposed to fracturing it. Yeah.
Sort of risk reward. You risk your lives for 3 weeks, you get a little fucking two-can rule every Friday or something like that. But
work hard, play hard, but do so in moderation.
Yeah, exactly. What was the difference in culture then when you eventually got to 2 Commando? And you go back to that platoon commander role, don't you?
Yeah, so I went 2 Commando at that time was a 6-week selection course. I went from, you guys deal in kilos, yeah, not pounds?
Yeah, kilos, yeah.
I went from 94 kilos down to 78 kilos on my selection course. And then it's the rest of that year is spent on your reinforcement cycle, doing all the qualification courses. And, it's like, it is hardcore professional investment in you. Every single type of weapon suite, every single type of insertion method, from parachuting to fast roping to rappelling to watercraft, the close quarter battle piece, the shooting skill sets, shooting until your finger bloody hurts, and, just the repetition and constant mission profile. So that's where you're just like, right, I now get why special forces are so hard. Unfortunately, there's no magic pill or no magic piece of equipment. It's bloody hard work, but the resources, we had helicopters, we had more ammunition than we could fire. There wasn't the usual piss ass fanning around with little admin stuff. There were teams doing that admin stuff for you. The equipment you were issued was the state of the art equipment. And if it wasn't good enough, you go back and get new stuff. So the biggest cultural change and philosophical and psychological change came down to this. The mindset of the unit and the mindset of the capability was operationally focused. And any questions that came down to opinions or I don't want to do this or whatever were so easily cut through from the support staff level to the operator level in why are we doing this? What is our purpose? And that even followed through to, we were called up to do a number of other short notice missions in other parts of the world, and also within our own country. And the ability to all of a sudden have, a C-17 on the strip and have vehicles bombed up ready to go, and then have, requests for approvals in with government and, just proper real world cutting through red tape shit. Let alone then when you're deployed on operations and the exact same thing, yeah. It really set me up for absolute failure in the civilian world, thinking that people could be easily aligned and focused on purpose and cut through all these things. I went, the mentality in there was why not, or can do, we can do this. Why not? Why can't we do this? And if no one gave me a good answer, then we're going to do it. And that it came with an immense responsibility for constantly, as an officer level, constantly providing briefs, risk mitigations, having to take people, be those your senior hierarchy, foreign diplomats, whatever, on the journey with you to appreciate where you're at the intuitive level and narrate it for them at an operational strategic level. But it was just, it was so much clearer. There was so much less uncertainty in the day-to-day operations and strategy and logic and philosophy and mindset around it. There was a lot of uncertainty in what we were going to do. But, no mountain was too high to climb. And it was intoxicating.
Yeah.
It was absolutely intoxicating to go from a level of performance whereby I say this to people. By the time I deployed with my platoon towards the end of 2012 to Afghanistan, we were already at like a level of team cohesion. We talk about like ESP sort of level stuff from even the planning team that was myself with my sergeants. I had most of my team commanders were sergeants, through to some absolutely gun junior NCOs as well. My job was to, corral the team, manage them, steer the rudder of the ship, and then make the end state decisions. But at the same time, someone's already looking out for you. If the boss has got a feed or, is taking you to the gym to help you with your time management, because I'm just in there planning all day.
Yeah.
Through to out on the ground, turning, something kicks off on the right-hand side, and before you even have to turn, you guys are dealing with it. And then you're helping just get them assets over there and force multiplying to it. I had this philosophy. I'd always rather rein in a stallion than kick a mule. And it was so incredible just being pulled along and riding along with a group of stallions, and just having the requirement to finesse and refine them and just put that combat power and effort and energy into achieving some incredible results, and results that you're never going to be able to match.
That's a good statement. I've not heard that one before. I'd rather rein in a stallion than kick a mule. There's a similar one I like to use as ships are safest in the harbour, but that's not what they're made for. Kind of the same.
Oh, that's a good one.
Kind of the same
that applies to many sort of the strategic decision conversations we're having at the moment. But that was also particularly within Australian culture, and a lot of this is coming out with our Afghan issues and inquiry at the moment, where our special forces were really at that time the only true force elements that were truly trusted and enabled to do their job. And it does come from purely, like you were saying, a risk mitigation measure. We were employed to do things back at home and even overseas that were roles for the infantry, mate. I did a 3-day clearance of the Kajaki Fan with a troop of Abrams tanks attached to me from the US Marine Corps during my deployment in 2012. I was doing fire movement with tanks. Like, that is un-SF as fuck. The giant bullet magnets. I was saying we should be, using the tanks as a distraction each night, hopping on helos and, coming in behind them and doing all this sort of shit. But the US commander of that regional area was unwilling to send any force in there less than a brigade size, unless it was the commando company with his tanks going in there,
Yeah. The standard US sort of ops, isn't it? Sending fucking... I remember one of my mates was he's a Royal Marine, and he went and done an exercise with the US Marines out in Nevada, which is obviously epic, and they got a piss up in Las Vegas as like an R&R at the end. But he was saying that like they were going down, a live fire range, and it was, platoon size live fire range, and they'd fucking swept up in a matter of a couple of hours or whatever. And then he said that the US Marines came afterwards, and they just had Humvees and fucking, they had like Apaches and like a company size worth of guys, and it took them twice as long. And I was like, what the fuck? I'd never experienced it like that. I'd worked with a few Americans as attached, but never with like an actual force. So I hadn't really experienced how they do, how they operate on the ground in terms of their, operational tactics or anything like that. But he was telling me, it's like, bro, you would never fucking believe it. They just essentially just got an extended line and just marched forward. I was like, Jesus Christ, we've got such a capability in terms of our tactics on the ground in the UK from how I understand it as a section commander. Like you mentioned earlier, you're an SME in leadership. I'm an SME in infantry tactics, because that's what I've done them, section commander's battle course and your platoon sergeant's battle course. It's like, that's all you know. So when I hear someone tell me they just get an extended line and fucking march forward with all these assets, it's like, Jesus Christ, like that's just not the way it's done anymore.
Yeah, it was just different tactics. Even between the US, I've spent a lot of time working with the US units, and it's even because they're so huge. You can definitely see such differences in the individual formations, even individual formations within formations within formations. And you're right, there is a huge reliance on assets provided to them, but that comes from a place of always having assets with them. Whereas, countries like yours and mine are always relying on other people's assets. So a lot more of our investment, be that in resources, in time, and particularly in money, goes into that individual level training. If you don't have, and as you know, that's the hardest level of training is actually in the individual person, because the individual person has to then decide to do those actions, whereas technology and systems, do those by design. So it's very interesting seeing, where you have the resources to do this, and you don't have to spend as much time in this because you can actually achieve the same outcome.
Yeah.
Whereas over here, you don't have this, then you need to put more in down here in order to bring things up.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah, different horses for courses, but I've definitely, and as you know yourself, mate, that's the best part about the infantry, and particularly these days where our roles just keep chopping and changing left, right, and centre. It all comes down to what the task is, and that's where we always need to make sure that we maintain ourselves and our own mindsets to be able to adapt to that and make sure we are relevant and applicable as opposed to redundant and set in our ways.
Yeah. And you deployed, that first deployment was as a platoon commander, right?
The first deployment to Afghanistan, I was actually the personal security officer for our Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. And I was just a couple of weeks over there, mate.
How was that?
Random, mate. Well, it was very random for me. It's like, first ever trip to Afghanistan, and our PSD, Protected Security Detachments, is usually commanded by a captain or a senior NCO, and I was a very capable. I was very capable of my individual skills as a officer as well. Again, I was much younger, and I always, came from quite a physicality in my skill set. So I was actually like a very good shot, very good at most of those close quarter battle and close quarter shooting type stuff. So I could actually match it with a lot of the other guys who were trying to go in for it. But particularly with the Prime Minister, you can imagine there was a lot of other security clearances required for a lot of the meetings she was going into.
Yeah.
And it always behoved us on the tactical level to have someone in there to admittedly feed back to our unit, but also be there to support her, mate. And that's from like a real-time risk perspective. So yeah, I was hers. And that was literally my first trip to Afghanistan. Looking back from the perspective of being there 4 times now, and by the second, third, fourth time, particularly by the third, fourth time, you're like, hurry up. No, that's not it. That's the bird I need to get on. This is where I am. The level of comfort is like you're just visiting a mate's place or flying into the States. Whereas the first time you're like, and we're staging in Dubai in the UAE.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, what the hell was it like being a fly on the wall, traveling around with the Prime Minister? It must have been fucking crazy.
It was, because the whole time, I'm like, holy shit, I'm looking after the Prime Minister. Of course, it's our first ever female Prime Minister. Well done, Heston. And she, to be honest, mate, she was fantastic. Behind closed doors, she was absolutely fantastic. And it was great to see, and very enlightening to see the difference between politics in front of the camera and the person and actual leadership potential behind the camera that was never allowed to be realised, because politicians' first purpose is to their party, not to the Australian people.
Yeah.
It was really fascinating to see that. But at the same time, mate, I'm trying to focus on this. Then I'm also knowing that the next year I was going to be deployed over there as a platoon commander on a combat rotation, trying to also soak everything in and speak to as many guys. And it was, I probably wouldn't have preferred to have done that again. I definitely would have preferred to have gone over there first. But I'm never going to look a gift horse in the mouth like that again.
Yeah.
And it's a great story anyway, that's for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And were you, when you went over, was it just working in Kabul with her, or were you doing trips out to see boys and fobs or whatever? Yeah,
so we first things first, we actually flew into Tarankout, which is where the Australians were based, and then did a meeting with all the conventional forces down there, and then took her up to the Special Operations Task Group, and then it was into Kabul, and did everything. Who met and worked with the US 4-star who was heading up the ISAF, heading up the NATO forces, and she was fantastic. She was at that point in time, 2012 or 2011, we were already talking about the drawdown of troops, and she went straight in there saying, these are the lines of whichever tier of ISR we need in order to maintain operations, and this is what we need from support assets, and this is what we need. I was like, holy cow, she's speaking green. It was good to go. Yeah. And then we had a one-on-one meeting with then President Karzai, and that was very different. I had to go in there and do a recce and actually meet with his security force with another one of my guys. And there was a lot of posturing and positioning, and, they didn't want me to bring a weapon in. And, it was very, very interesting. Again, it was pretty cool.
Did Karzai have Delta operators at that time as his security?
No, he didn't. He had...
He eventually did get them, didn't he? Or was that previous?
I don't know, mate. Yeah, when I was there, all I remember dealing with is suited up security force who were definitely locals. But yeah, there's a lot in those places, in those situations. There's a lot going on behind closed doors, and it was very, very interesting. Yeah. The whole time everyone's trying to get more information out of you than you're willing to tell, and it was fun. No, as far as again, learning some of those great skills that set you up for interesting question time at the pub with a local later on down the track in your life. It's fun having those real life training sessions, I call them, engaging with people pretending that they don't speak English and
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was good.
In terms of Afghanistan in general, then, like you mentioned that you were back and forward there a bunch of times. What was your best deployment that you look back on with your fondest memories, or maybe not even your fondest memories, but just as like one that's at the forefront of your mind?
Yeah, so my deployment to Special Operations Task Group Rotation 18, so that was middle to the end of 2012, was hands down the highlight of my career, whereby we talk about everything from finally being tested in the absolute art and craft of what we've been trained to do, through to leading and in being inspired by the soldiers that I was responsible for leading over there on missions against enemy who, we had the authority to kill or capture because they had previously engaged with terrorist activities, killed civilians, detonated suicide IEDs, through to one of the most, incredible and traumatic experiences, like losing one of my absolute best guys, to an IED in one of the most, horrific ways that no one should ever have to see. And then for the unique circumstance to me, and this is probably that mission in particular where I lost Scott, is probably one of the most terrible and tremendous, for the simple fact that it was so terrible the way in which we lost Scott and the fact that we lost Scott. It happened on day one of a 3-day clearance. And just for perspective, even in the Australian deployments to Afghanistan, usually within at least 24 hours, that call sign was then back out of the field and sort of dealing with what they needed to. Whereas we were back out there still for another 48 hours, another 2 days. And this is one of the key stories that I used to go back to our Royal Military College and tell the guys about lessons in leadership, whereby I not only had to refocus, recalibrate, and even change of task and redirection of the guys on the ground to then continue on and achieve our mission after losing Scott. We're talking after 3 hours worth of collecting as much of Scott as we could under fire and reconstituting the platoon and refocusing everyone in a period whereby we, for the first time, had lost one of our own, again, in a terrible way. And you can imagine all the emotions going through us, through to having to do that on a personal level before asking my guys to do that, and then having to command, lead, and manage them through that for the rest of the period, to prosecute targets and to do so in a way that will not only keep Scott proud, but will keep us together and make sure that we maintained our fighting capability for that mission and for the rest of the missions that we still have to do, because we still had plenty of time in Afghanistan. So a lot of these conversations in our Australian media at the moment talk about this warrior culture and the pros and cons. And my key statement is that war has the ability to, war by extreme nature, is hard to comprehend and hard to understand, and unless you've been there yourself. And war really tests people down to that, every mortal fibre that they potentially have. That it really tests their personal morals, their personal ethos. And the best part about everything I experienced over there was I saw war turn people into the greatest version of themselves, whereby they truly were selfless. They did not care for their own lives. And I don't say that in any form of callous or irresponsible way. They just so wholeheartedly cared for the people they were there working with and fighting for, and the cause and the mission and the people back home that they were doing so for as well. So much so that they did not fear for their own safety, and they weren't ever held back from doing what needed to be done. And then in doing so, with that absolutely incredible situation, there's also the ability for it to corrupt people. And some people, without supervision, have probably done things that they shouldn't have done. And even at a personal, emotional level, without even acting out physically, I definitely felt some levels of that corruption. I remember after losing Scott, wanting to go and find the nearest insurgent, and even if he'd thrown down his weapon, I was going to do something to him and take his life in return. And that never came along. But I still remember, and I still carry that, and now sort of appreciate that, even though that's not in the heat of battle, like that's that fog of war that creeps in to us. And particularly when we're fighting counterinsurgencies, and particularly when there is no real threat, but there always is a threat, be that under the ground, be that an insider attack, be that the next mission. I could happily live, mate, with losing my own life in combat. I could happily live with myself getting injured. When I lost one of my guys, it starts to tear a little bit at, if you're doing your job good enough. But then, I knew we were, and I knew the team we had there, and I didn't have time to focus on that. But then, when you're presented with those circumstances time and time and time again, and those same threats time and time and time again, that's really where you start to recognize that, one, how truly exceptional those people are around you and the way that they can just conduct themselves and crack on through it. But secondly, that there is always that potential for it to just finally chip away at people, and for things to potentially occur either there on the ground or later down the track. And it's also very hard to recover from essentially that greatness. It's hard to recover from literally becoming the truly best version of yourself through circumstances that are never going to be replicated in everyday life, unless you live in some pretty bad suburbs of Dublin or something. I don't know. But and there's, to be honest, mate, the hardest part about all of this, I know I'm jumping ahead of myself here, is actually living with never being that great again, and living with never having that responsibility, and living with never having that team again. Because by the time we finished that deployment at the end of 2012, we were at just such a fine-tuned level, mate, that you could have asked us to, go to hell and back, and we would. And this was the first true emotional trauma I suffered professionally, outside of the loss of Scott. Sorry, I mean, more so mean in career-wise, was at the end of 2012, I had to move on from being a platoon commander and become like the company XO. And mate, I wrote letters to the CEO. I went out kicking and screaming. It hurt, and it was such an interesting part for me to realize. And to answer your question, my deployment in Afghan 2012 was the greatest I have ever been personally, because I was responsible for guys, and I was in the conditions that were, life and death and all that good stuff, and responsible for Australian strategic interests and all that good stuff. I've then gone on to, be more impressed with my performance professionally in a career sense. But as far as being directly responsible for people who I was never more proud to be responsible for, that was my greatest there and then in the second half of 2012.
Yeah, it's that phrase you said earlier on about never being as great again, or never being as cool again. I have the exact same thing from 2009. I was 18 years old, and like looking back now, it's like I will never be as cool as I was when I was fucking 18. Like, and as a grown adult, it's like, fuck, like what's the point anymore?
Oh, you're 29 years old.
30.
Oh, you're 30.
Yeah.
Spring chicken. All right.
But it's like it's just fucking it's just looking back on those times and those deployments, and the reason why it was like that is because you're all in such a harsh, extreme environment together that you're completely at one with what you've got to do. Like you mentioned earlier on, you'd be more than happy to lose your own life, but losing the life of someone else is traumatic. And we lost a bunch of guys in that deployment, but I was lucky enough to actually not know any of them, so I never really had to process it like that. It was just literally FNG, straight from basic training. And, you know, dealing with that for the guys who were in a leadership position at that time, platoon sergeants and platoon commanders and OCs, it must be fucking horrendous.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know how I would have dealt with it had I been in a position like that.
I think the key part, and you touched on it beforehand, like I said before about being more than willing to losing yourself than losing someone else. But it's also like people, it's very hard like explaining that to, you know, everyday civilians these days. It almost sounds like too romantic and too much of a movie, but like it really is, you know, tell them that I was never once fearful going in on all those terrible bumpy landings we had helicopters, yet I'll get on a flight from Sydney to Brisbane and hit turbulence and be praying to God 14 times before I hit the ground. Like, you know, it's just so different. But also you knew, because we were at that intuitive level and that just assumed level of mateship and cohesion with each other. We knew each other also thought that same way. So, you know, feeling sad for this person that died was always going to happen, but you knew that they were having those same feelings, that they would have preferred to have died before you. So particularly as a commander, my platoon sergeant at the time was actually one of the best ones to have this sort of conversation with me. I was always very good at compartmentalizing my emotions. You know, when I got back from that 3-day mission, you know, I got the platoon phone and I called my mum and I cried like a baby because, you know, I'd actually met Scott's friends. I met his partner before we deployed. I hadn't met his mum yet at that time. And that's where your head goes to, is like their loss.
Yeah.
It's about the other's loss of him, not so much the loss of his life. I definitely missed his loss within us, but you know, it's a part of that warrior culture whereby it's not quite the Valhalla celebration type thing, but you know that it's terrible that they're gone, but so inspiring that they went doing what they loved for those that they truly loved in those moments.
Yeah.
So I never really got taken over by grief in those situations, and even going out on those missions and then cracking on and putting us and our guys and myself in risk. You never, as long as you knew why you were doing it, you know, and that you had planned your ass off and you know, you were confident in your skill sets and you'd done all your mission rehearsals and preparations. You know, there was never a time I stepped out thinking that we were ill prepared or we didn't have the skill sets to do what we needed to do. And as terrible as it sounds, like sometimes shit happens.
Yeah.
And if shit happens, you know, we will know that we will have gone down doing to the very best of our ability and doing what we wanted to do. We didn't want to be anywhere else in the world, but out there doing that. And we knew that that came with risks. And the worst thing you could have done is deny us from doing that. So it was actually very easy carrying forward, knowing that everyone was in that mindset. It really removed a lot of that emotion of like, well, being worried about losing each other. As long as you weren't reckless and as long as I did my job and everyone did their job, it was actually like really, really comforting knowing that you weren't with a group of people who were worried about their own survival. They were more focused on getting shit done.
Yeah, it's that what you said there about the boys not wanting to be anywhere else. Like they would literally rather be doing nothing else with their life. And the reason is you know, you're fucking taking bad guys off the planet. You're doing a good for the world and for society in general. And you know, if you take the fight to bad guys in their ground, then you mitigate the risk of them coming to your homeland and, you know, having an impact on your family potentially. And one of my biggest regrets is something that I had no control over whatsoever. But, you know, you look back in hindsight is, you know, as a regret almost, is not having involvement with, you know, with dealing with ISIS and Daesh or whatever. You know, the UK done, you know, very little in terms of contributing to that. I know they had SF units out there non-stop, but you know, you look back and you think Afghanistan, Iraq, where could we really have made a big difference? And it definitely would have been fighting ISIS. But at the same time, it's like, you know, how many of these areas are you willing to go to? Because, you know, there's Boko Haram in Africa. Are you willing to, you know, send battalions and brigades and divisions to that conflict as well? And then, you know, you could go all over. You could literally, it's completely endless the amount of conflict there is in the world. But I think for me, like, you know, that involvement with ISIS that I never got the opportunity to take on is a regret. And like I said, it's nothing that I had any control over whatsoever. But you know, I'd have fucking loved to wipe some of those boys out.
No, it is so interesting, mate. And I'm with you. I was chomping at the bit to get over there because
let's just talk it as far as like a physical manifestation of the modern day definition of evil, by Western standards, by what we saw over there, what we saw was occurring from, what we saw them doing to those they captured through to those locals. There's unequivocal, that is evil that needs to be eradicated from the earth. And that was truly, like, from me actually going over there, and our commander unit partnered a lot with the counter-terror, what do they call bloody CTC? No. The Iraqi Special Counter-Terrorist Unit, Counter-Terrorist Police Unit. Bloody hell. Yeah. I've been out of it too long. Sorry, mate.
Is that the guys that drive about in the black Hummers and they're all dressed up in black? Yeah.
Yeah. Like, mate, watching them just be so inspired. And, they were the best fighters, and it was very inspirational seeing these people like taking up the mission to defend and take back their homeland personally, and I never got to go out there on the ground with the guys. I was admittedly at that time dealing with synergies between Iraq and Syria and, Peshmerga and future weapons arms procurement for the Iraqi forces. It was very cool doing that big boy stuff. But when I did get to go down and engage with, and actually to see, at that time there were bloody drones watching everything ridiculous, and then going and engaging with my former commando guys who were the team commanders on the ground with them, and just that level of fighting, it was very interesting to see just the level of inspiration that absolute evil did bring about. But you're right, and there's plenty of that all around the world, like Boko Haram and whatnot. But now we start getting into the strategic priorities of what matters on the grand scheme of scale, what they actually threaten. I don't want to sit here getting into bloody strategies and politics with you, but there's actually like a key point to note, mate, for all veterans and infantrymen and the like watching this, is that we sign up for uncertainty. We sign up for the possibility to go and do whatever. And the fact that some of us got to do that and some of us didn't doesn't make us any better than anyone else. It makes us more experienced in those areas. But in particular within our veteran community, working forward and moving forward from here, it's so important for us to acknowledge the fact that we all signed up for service. We all had different journeys along the way, and that doesn't make us better, because some of those people who never got those opportunities would have potentially performed better than us. They just never got the opportunity to do so, but they still signed up for the opportunity to do that. And that makes them better than the majority of everyday people in our population, because they're willing to openly sign up to something that was yet to be written, and could have had their death tomorrow, could have had their death the next month, could have had them do things that they never thought they would have to do as a human being, or nothing, or sit back in an FOB and do nothing. They never got to pick those adventures. So I don't know. What's the veteran community like over there with you at the moment? Here in Australia, we have a lot going on with mental health and all this sort of good stuff. I'm just intrigued to hear what the situation is with you.
I mean, I particularly, I'm not too involved with it. I don't really think that there's a huge community in terms of involvement. I think a lot of guys get out and are happy to get out and just crack on with something new. There is obviously people, there's a bunch of guys on social media. There's a bunch of guys doing TV, but I think the engagement with regular Joe public is very limited. It's not, it's definitely not what the Americans have got in terms of. Sure. In terms of support for veterans that are struggling.
Never going to have that. The Americans, and I lived a couple of years there, like I said before, until you're attacked on your own home soil, you're never going to have that. And that's part of what we sign up to do, and we didn't sign up for that recognition. But that you just can't compare it to the Americans until you have like a 9/11 style incident, to be honest. Yeah.
Or a Pearl Harbor. Fuck.
Yeah, man.
But like people are appreciative, but every time I meet someone that that's new in my life, they don't have a fucking clue what the army does or what they've been doing. It's like they don't even know that Afghan's a thing. It's like, oh, I thought you boys were out in Iraq. It's like, well, we've kind of been doing another thing in another country for 17 years. It's they generally just don't know that. It's not because they're ignorant. It's just because they've not been exposed to it. And I would say that's the vast majority of the public. Unless they're
that was literally the same as us until last year. Exactly the same. We are now having all these catch-up conversations because we've had this critical report, an incident going through. But yeah, that's it. And that's actually been so hard for a lot of our veteran community to comprehend, is that such an important part of their life, the part of their life that saw them to absolute greatness, isn't even
understood, let alone recognised within the regular community. And that's where it's very easy for them to lead to a sense of entitlement. But it's fascinating, isn't it, how something can be your entire life and not even a blip on the radar of someone else's.
Yeah, we had a similar instance to, you know, what you were talking about earlier on about, you know, you wanted to go and do something to you know, one of those guys if you'd had the chance. We had a similar incident where a Royal Marines platoon sergeant had been on tour for back-to-back tours for a while, maybe 3 or 4, you know, back-to-back, and then he had already lost about 2 or 3 guys from his platoon that deployment, and then he ends up getting in a contact, and AH comes on scene and takes a couple of guys out, and then they go and do the BDA, and they find this guy who's, you know, critically injured, critically wounded, you know, Taliban bloke, and he gets caught on head camera saying that I'm going to fucking kill this guy, and he does. And then a few years later that gets out. I think it was from an aggrieved ex-wife or something like that.
I remember saying that, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, that was quite distressing for the public. You know, that it was kind of very divisive. You know, half the public was saying "fuck them," that's what they fucking deserve, and then the other half was outraged at how could this be happening. And it just goes to show, like, you know, people generally have had their life so comfortable throughout 20 years of modern warfare that they don't even have an idea of what, you know, the members of society who are in the armed forces have been engaged with. And that's, you know, I'm not condoning that at all, obviously. But at the same time, it's like, that's the realities of war. People are going to do things, you know, with clouded judgment. You know, is he evil? Is he, you know, a horrible person? Absolutely not. I'm sure he's got a wife and kids that he loves dearly, but he maybe just made a bad decision through clouded judgment because he'd been overstressed for so long and for such an extreme amount of stress for so long, that he, you know, ended up coming to that decision on that day. But it's just like, people are just unexposed to it. They're not exposed enough to you know, what your 18-year-old guys are, you know, fucking having to carry on patrol, what they're having to do when they fucking engage with the enemy, what they're having to do when one of their own is wounded. You know, they just generally don't have a clue what we've been facing recently.
Absolutely, man. And, you know, part of that, I actually take great pride in the fact that we sort of sign up to protect our nation and its people physically, mentally, and emotionally. And part of that is, you know, I'm actually very happy for them not to know some of that evil in the world. But, you know, there's also so many huge lessons learned to be brought out about, and we're talking about Afghanistan in particular here. You know, this has been our nation, Australia's longest war. I'm pretty sure it's the same for you guys. And, you know, just that in itself, you know, there's obviously new mistakes that have been made, new lessons that have to be learned and recorded, including, you know, back-to-back deployments and the actual reason why, you know, we decompress people and manage them along the way and make sure they have breaks in between. And, you know, we can backtrack and look for some common threads in some of those issues, be those societal issues, behavioural issues, or tactical issues like you discussed beforehand. But also just the appreciation that, you know, we need to politically make sure we have these clearly defined strategies and units of measures and communicating those things. And because the issue with soldiers at all levels is that, you know, we're very adequate at going out there and finding things to be done, particularly when there's obviously shit that needs to be done. So you need to make sure that you're ensuring it's in accordance with the standards you need and what needs to be done there on the ground as a part of the strategy. And at the same time, and I don't know about you guys, but in our experiences, to make sure that you are allowing them to do what needs to be done and not all of a sudden bringing in new units of measures such as risk acceptance and mitigation, and actually denying them from doing what glaringly needs to be done because you actually impact them a lot more. And I've had a few chats with a lot of other international guys as well, particularly as things started to draw down, they started to lose lots of casualties over there, whereby they have some of their biggest emotional injuries from not being allowed to actually do what they could have done.
Yeah.
And not so much in revenge of their mates, but just in the simple fact of feeling fulfilled in the task that they've been trained and prepared their whole life to do type stuff. Yeah.
I'll probably just skip forward a little bit.
Okay, do it.
To, you know, point where you become to OCSF selection. You know, kind of getting off a, you know, taking a big leap here, but kind of skipping a lot of your career, but getting to the OCSF selection. how did that role come about for you? And was that something that you chose, or were you selected into that position?
I always wanted to do it, to be honest. So I was over with the US. Well, actually, it was the big selection part was for us. Each year, one captain got sent over to do the exchange with the US 75th Range Regiment, and that included a deployment with their classified task force. And I was adjutant, and then deployed over to do that. And I sort of secured before coming back that I was going to do that role. And I just love that training and investment. And it also sort of comes back to a bit of the story I was telling you previously about, even my first years as a lieutenant within the infantry battalion, and seeing how important it was at those initial ab initio levels, including particularly this selection and training of the future generation, to make sure that it was done the right way, not only just in what you achieved at that personal level, particularly when you're in special forces. And, but gaining entry into any form of exclusive, let alone elite organization, there's always sort of egos and attitudes involved. And I really wanted to help try and cut through some of that and, and do what I can to influence to make sure we're really taking things up to the next level. So, I ended up coming back, and it was at a time whereby we were really going through a bit of a transformation. This is 2016 in the way in which we were selecting people, because operations were drawn down in Afghanistan, and we were really focusing a lot more on the Asia Pacific region, and tasks became less and less defined. But what became more defined was the need for higher levels of emotional intelligence, less reliance on physical capabilities as priority, and more focus on selecting the right person that we could train to do the right things. And I know that sounds very straightforward, but there really is sometimes a bit of a philosophical switch. And I was benefited by being able to bring in a sports psychologist, a psychiatrist, a behavioral psychologist, most of those were women, to be honest, and a couple of other former members who are now in sort of sports and high performance. And we did everything from cortisol testing and putting people through parameters whereby we were actually testing the buildup of stress and levels and everything in the body, through to really refining things like deprivation of basically love languages, basically ways in which people feel valued, things like silent running, things like isolation, creating extra uncertainty, trying to entice things like anxiety and anticipation within the people even further, and even combining a lot more of elemental training. So in the elements, embracing cold, embracing dark, embracing things like that. So, mate, it was fantastic. And as far as like being a bookend to my career, being able to really sit down, redefine, redevelop, and then execute that as the selection course, and then that ongoing training that we put into and assessment criteria and monitoring that we put into the reinforcement cycle, you can imagine that I was at a point in my time where I had done pretty much all the different operational capabilities and some other cool stuff within special forces, bookended the other end by what was still the hardest thing I'd ever done in my career, which was a selection course at a personal level, breaking you down physically and mentally to reveal you emotionally. And then I was able to finally like pick back threads from where I was here designing and assessing this course back to where I was there all the way through my career, and really help to identify what were those key attributes that I had to develop along the way to be here. What were those environmental or human factors that helped to influence that? And really start quantifying some of the emotional intelligence that I actually had within me, and just putting it into words and putting it into frameworks and structures. And mate, I loved it. Like literally, as far as like, opening up my brain and my emotional intelligence, tenfold, it all happened in those sort of 18 months there at SFTC. And it was fantastic. And from a personal satisfaction level, mate, from being able to design this course that was literally putting people through all these different layers of assessment, to then being able to spend the better part of a year investing in those individuals. And, I had all the officers in addition as the officer trainees as my personal Padawans, as far as teaching them all of the successes and mistakes that I'd made tactically across all the theaters I deployed to. There's just nothing like that. And you can imagine these are, these are high performance people. They're not sort of regular people. They're at the level of high performance, and they want to become elite, and they are sponges, and they are chomping at the bit for anything you can give them. And that's also a huge responsibility. And that's where I wanted to micromanage and do that part myself, because I'd seen too many other people bring personal arrogance and ego and the wrong things into it. But it was so satisfying. And I even imply that now to people who sort of get out of the military and lose their way because they're no longer able to perform to their greatness. Being able to find a way to be able to give back and pass on that knowledge and mentor and train is one of the best cathartic and therapeutic methods that I've ever found, because it replicates what I was able to do in that latter part of my career on that course.
Yeah, that self-evaluation portion that you talked about there, was there anything that you particularly implemented in terms of the training package or the training course that you put in because of that self-evaluation, or do you think it was just general an overview of yourself that allowed you to have a better understanding of what you were looking for in blokes?
I think in particular, it really helped me to bring in a lot more in some of the finite selection criteria for the officers, particularly at the end. And in particular, some of my justification for keeping or removing some of the people in the boards of selection. And again, that was just actually through conversations by which I had to provide briefings up to the respective unit commanders and even the special forces commanders to really help justify that, despite these people achieving greens across the board in physical attributes, these other character attributes they demonstrated were actually the makings of potential culture cancer. And it was really fun, going in there and having these emotional intelligent conversations. Some of them got very combative, because this was at a time whereby people are really wanting to build and grow their capability, and they need more people. They need, and it's very easy to get stuck into this superficial assessments of, some of these people that look like modern day warriors. But we were sort of experiencing already some of the stirrings and issues from across the command as far as what happens when you don't focus enough on the character and personality traits of culture and focus too much on operational capability, as the pendulum was starting to swing back the other way. We had some fantastic seasoned operational warriors who were really lacking their relevance in being able to support the large part of hearts and minds and influencing strategic partners, political leaders, and all those sort of things, and some of the other stuff we needed to do back home and in our local international environment. So, it was really trying to make sure that we weren't simply building forces and picking people that were good to deploy to high combat operations, but couldn't sustain themselves and best represent us within those lower but more strategic and more increasing roles that we needed to fulfill.
I think that goes across the board now as well. Just in, taking it back to regular infantry units. I'm just guessing, but I guess back in the day, your best blokes would have been the fucking, like you said, the ultimate warrior, whoever or whatever. The guy that can do all the pull-ups and fucking do the best PFT or whatever, and is an absolute he-man. But what I began to notice as I kind of went on different courses and grew through the ranks is that those guys are useless if they can't stand in front of a platoon and deliver a set of orders, or they can't even talk to the boss and tell them why they're implementing these control measures. It's like they don't know why they're doing something. So there's no point in being the best physically if you can't cognitively fucking put it together. That kind of seems as what you were just describing there.
Absolutely, and that's it. We will get to the points at the end of the best part was, I remember on that first course, we got to a point whereby we had to stop some of the activities because some of the people we had were literally going to break themselves before they stopped, because they were so emotionally invested in what they were doing. And that's the person that I can train to do anything. Obviously, they've had to get through a number of gates to get there, but it's that person that's actually not truly outside of their physical comfort zone. It's, that former Ironman, that former football player, professional football player, whatever, who then when they finally get through that crumble, that's what we're trying to remove. But those who lost their physical and mental resilience a long time ago, but their heart is literally holding onto that dumbbell, they're the people that are worth their weight in gold. And that's the inspiring part, seeing that, you can mold that metal into whatever you need it to be.
Yeah. And then just in terms of selecting for officers and enlisted lads, how does that differ? Are they doing the exact same things, but you're just aware of the officers who are in the pack, or are they involved in different tasks and different training?
So they're doing the exact same thing and more. So the officers had to attend a pre-week for the selection course where we absolutely smashed them in planning. And then, it was definitely a pre-fatiguing exercise. And then throughout the actual selection course, they're assessed on additional criteria that include leadership, and some others that are in intellectual property, and I can't mention, but they're assessed against those, and they're often put in leadership positions. But then again, mate, they're put in tail and Charlie positions where they're not in leadership positions to see, because the art of being a great leader is learning how to also be a great follower and a great supporter when needed. So there are much more expectations on them. It was also a very interesting philosophical time within our unit, particularly with the drawdown again from high-end warfighting operations in the Middle East, to really start to do a proper assessment on what was actually the capability requirement of our special forces officers at that time. The alphas, the platoon commanders, those who could go out and kick doors in with their dudes, were rapidly drawing down and much more reliant on those who could, very quickly be able to provide strategic back briefs to ministers and foreign government agents and things like that, to be able to then gain approvals to deploy forces for short notice tasks. Whereas actually a lot of those most seasoned platoon commanders who've been kicking in doors for the last 4 or 5 years in the unit couldn't do that themselves, because they didn't have the correct aptitude, character traits, but most particularly emotional intelligence. And then how we look to actually provide mechanisms within the selection and training continuum to help even start to depict potential roles therein. So, it's if anyone goes insane with overthinking, I sit here and overthink everything, and you're sitting there overthinking the overthinking. But it's fantastic. You're looking at it through the lens of potential capability, as opposed to, trying to scrape the bottom of the barrel. So these are good problems to have.
Yeah.
It just comes from a place of, again, OCD and trying to over-engineer things to as near as possible perfection, that it's very easy to tire yourself out very quickly.
Yeah. I always like to express to people how impressive, regular human beings are that, decide to join the infantry and, proceed to other, higher levels of operating. And one of the ways that, I think of doing that is just if getting someone to describe an environment where you've had to work through a complex problem, and you've had to reorientate or orientate yourself as a leader, be that on operations or even back in barracks in Australia. Like, could you maybe think of a scenario where that's happened to you, where it's been so complex that you never ever thought that this would be a problem that you would be tasked with solving?
Oh, there's actually a lot that jump into mind. I want to find one that's like actually relatable and enjoyable. So one extremely fun, complex problem I had to work through was actually when I was the XO, or the Company 2IC for the commando company. And we basically needed to demonstrate a rehearsal of operational capability that would see us tactically deploy a commando company from Sydney up to Papua New Guinea in a training exercise, as opposed to an actual operational exercise, and land a commando force element in and then conduct some operations. And, it sounds cool easily tactically, but then, we wanted to fly a commando company in, conduct a parachute load follow, then go to shore with our Zodiacs and, be prepared to conduct full mission profiles and things like that. But the realities are there's levels and layers of customs and border control and clearances and diplomatic passes and everything else in between. And my company commander that I had at that time, he was never actually a commander platoon commander. He was a JTAC, but he had a 50-pound brain, mate. He was the one schooling me on conversations between complicated and complex and the differences between the two. And I was just like, ugh. So then he's like, hey, Heston, I'm going to send you, and you get to pick one soldier you want to send with you, one commander you want to go with you, because, it's always better to just operate in pairs. And I want to be able to land the company in here and do this, and your job is to go and make it happen. So I had a week where I had to just get myself over to Papua New Guinea, which I hadn't been to I went there once in my infantry days, and I had to very rapidly acquaint myself with every single layer of government that I could to get to a point whereby, in accordance with all Army training standards, I had everything from the local Papua New Guinean reconnaissance force guys out there on their banana boats on the drop zone acting as safety craft, through to, pre-collecting a drop of passports to have them pre-stamped, parachute drop of passports in a parcel to have them pre-stamped. So it was when the guys landed by the time the guys landed in their boats and the boats landed on shore, they'd all been stamped and they weren't breaching international law and policy.
Holy shit.
Mate, it was fantastic. But to top it off, for the prize for my success in doing so, what the OC also wanted to do was to test the Australian Border Force capabilities for their ability to detect small craft infiltrating from Papua New Guinea back to Australia. So what we did is we got a flotilla of our F470 Zodiacs, which are 4.7 meter black dinghy Zodiacs, loaded up with 2 or 3 men per Zodiac. I think we had about 8 Zodiacs at the end of it. We call it the flotilla. And I got to, as the Company 2IC, go back to being a platoon commander and command the flotilla driving from an island in the Papua New Guinea all the way down to Weipa in the north of Australia. I think it took us 3 days, about 3 layers of skin chafed off every single person. It included going to beaching on one island one night. I need to wake up in the morning and see the low tide made us carry these things about 400 meters out past coral and turtles. And, the tide went out 400 meters, but it was at half a meter level. It was ridiculous. Mate, it was incredible. And, just as far as that was one of those points, just like, hey, like there really isn't something that I can't solve with the right team and with just the right purpose and mindset. And it was just incredible. And that so much of that came down to practically solving problems, but also like just engaging with people and, likability and leadership. I had to lead. That's my mum sewing stuff in the back, by the way. That's not my just cross-dressing.
I didn't even notice that.
I just saw that. It didn't, likability versus leadership. I had to make, like the Papua New Guinean nationals and all that, and then the diplomats and stuff like me. And, you would bring into these people harebrained ideas. And it's not like with the authority of we're special forces, we're doing this. They could be like, get the hell out of my country. Yeah. It was fun. I was appreciating it. Didn't matter who you are. An authentic voice carries its own authority. You have to convince people and take them on the journey and make them earn and win trust in you. And that only comes from being competent in yourself and also your character as well. So there's so many great life lessons along the way.
Yeah. How was it living for 3 days?
If I never do that again, it'll be all too soon.
How was it living off the boats for 3 days?
Mate, the true test of culture is when it's no longer fun. And that was not fun, but we made it so much fun. Mate, we're driving along and then next thing in the Zodiacs, the next thing, like we're driving through a school of tuna that's jumping next to us. And one of my guys who was bloody part Aboriginal was hooking a line in and pulling thing up and skinning off this bit of tuna. And it was that hot beating down on our black Zodiacs that he'd cut these fine slivers of tuna and was cooking them on the side of the rubber. It was that hot, and he'd drive up past me and give boss taste this sashimi, and it was just. And you look over there, and there's a guy with his pants pulled down. The medic's like putting cream on these like bleeding sores on his butt that are chafing, and but it's just these are the stories you catch up with the boys and have beers about. And it's now a measuring stick. It's a unit of measure for any potential adversities you ever have in the rest of your life. Just like that's why we do selection courses. That's why we do our initial entry into the army. You need to have a benchmark to know what you can go through. When the going gets tough, it's great to have these fond memories and experiences to look back on, saying, hey, I've done this worse. And when you're with your team, hey, you remember that time we did this? I'm sure you've been good ones too, man.
Oh, mate, I've seen enough guys with ball rub and fucking, the chafing in their arse cheeks or whatever. And that's an impressive story. Just describe some of the impressive things that you've seen from your blokes throughout your time as a commando or as a platoon commander, or just in general from your time in the army.
Yeah, so a couple of key ones really stand out to me. Look, I'm always so readily and
privileged to be inspired by those that I have been responsible for, bottom up versus top down. Unfortunately, a lot of it throughout my career, I've actually had key issues with above me and expecting more from those I've been responsible to, expecting them to feel more responsibility for those under them, as opposed to playing politics up and out. I've openly clashed with the majority of my hierarchy, and there's been a bit of personal development along the way, but I probably wouldn't change any of that because I know where my true passion and motivation lies. But I remember Afghanistan 2012, there was Sergeant Hekmatullah had actually just killed 3 Australians during a green on blue attack. And during this time, the Australian government called cease operations for all of our conventional forces. They had to return to their bases. And this unfortunately came within 48 hours of the other commando platoon that I was over there with in Afghanistan lost 2 of their guys, Merv and Nate, from our same companies, Merv and Nate, to a chopper crash. So they were sort of out of operations doing that. So there was an SASR troop and my commando platoon, and we partnered to conduct about 3 weeks worth of operations to track down this Sergeant Hekmatullah. And we sort of knew who he was, and we were tracking him through technical means. But there was one night in particular, and it was about 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And we had a pretty accurate location on this guy, and we had human intelligence that he had planned to try and basically to conduct an exfil that night out through a valley that was, really difficult, thick terrain, let alone complex as far as it had local Afghan army outposts, it had Taliban positions, stuff like this, Taliban insurgent activities. And if he got through that valley, then he was going to exfil to Pakistan, and we would not be able to pursue him over the border and all that good stuff. And all that I could muster was 2 Black Hawks to be able to get us out there, just because shit was all over the battle space, even though this was like the blatant priority. Yeah. All we could get was 2 Black Hawks because of crew hours and all this. So I remember turning to one of my team commanders, my 1-1, who was my senior sergeant. And I was like, hey, look, this is the situation. I need you to have a think about getting out there and doing whatever you need to do in order to deter him from getting out. Like your task mission, I gave him a task effect, is disrupt. You are to disrupt this valley so as he does not able to conduct his exfil out to this location, in order to, it was a strategic priority for this guy to be able to be maintained. If he was maintained in the AO, then we could prosecute him in the next couple of days. And then for that sergeant to go away and make his team and have a look at the equipment available to us. We just actually come back from a lot of missions and stuff, and we're still in the whole rebombing phase. And, came back and basically sort of told me his plan, and he really needed to get out there and see the terrain. We didn't even have good mapping of this area. Like, it was not a proper, sophisticated special forces intelligence dev preparation. It was 2 hours go, and I needed to get him out there because the helicopters had to insert within the next 4 hours or some crap. And I didn't even get a diligent back brief from him. I just knew that I trusted him, and I made sure that he particularly back briefed me on his CASEVAC, casualty evacuation measures, and how he was going to maintain his command and control, particularly back to me and back to assets that I could push to him and support. And once he did that, it was guns go and get out there and get amongst it. And it was so fantastic. I was there sort of standing by the ops room with my call sign element out there ready with another guys ready to step up and go out there if he needed help. But, next thing, all that we hear is just the feedback report that, all sorts of shit's going on. And, I remember the CEO catching me in the mess. We'd eat cereal at, 12 o'clock at night or something. Like, I'll just say, what's the 1-1 doing out there? And he's like, disrupting, sir. He's like, yeah, he's doing a pretty good job. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, we're getting reports from the Afghan army that they don't know what's going on. We're getting local reports from people calling up saying there's a huge coalition operation being conducted here tonight. And long story short, we got them guys out just before first light and got them back to base. And all the reports just started streaming in human intelligence, because he was meant to step off at first light that next morning. It's like, you can't come through here. There was some massive coalition operation back here. We've only seen 2 helicopters lift out. There's still so many more in here. They must be lying, waiting for you. And long story short, mission achieved. But I think it was a total of, what do you take? 10, 11 dudes, managed to conduct a commando as fuck operation to disrupt with an ill-defined task just to achieve an effect that had a direct strategic impact on one of the most important strategic priorities we had at that time. I was so proud, and I tell that story so much. Just the simple fact that sometimes you just need to trust people to get out there and get it done. And you can imagine that came from a place of this guy demonstrating his competence and character to me time and time before. But being able to just sit back and I'm like, I have zero credit. It was all this man and his team. And it was some pretty wild shit that, they got fired on by an Afghan army post who didn't realize what was going on. But it all added to understanding that higher commander's intent, and they achieved it and some. And I was so proud to see that.
And this is something that I really did start the podcast to try and show to the wider society how impressive guys who have served are. Especially infantry guys, because they literally can fucking turn their hand to absolutely anything. Like you said, like I need you to go and do this, absolutely high-strung mission at such short notice, and then they overachieve. And that's my overarching view of a good infantry dude, or just in general a good bloke that served in the army. You give them a task and it will be done, but it will be done better than you're expecting. There's not
that was also fraught with risk of at the same time, there's the opportunity for civilian casualties, opportunity for something to go wrong was so paramount. But by just empowering you guys to have the trust and allowing them to, demonstrate their own individual brilliance, you can imagine you go away and it actually sets everyone else up to the next benchmark where you have a new level of trust, a new level of experience, and a new level of expertise. Yeah. And it's all sitting there waiting to happen.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of guys that get in touch recently that are like, "Oh, I'm going to Sandhurst, or I'm a new officer that's in this unit, blah blah blah," asking for my thoughts and my opinions. I'm like, fuck, I'm just giving them my 10 pence. But if they are listening, it's like you have to trust and you have to empower your subordinates. If you don't empower them, then you can't you can't allow them to develop and achieve success. And it's not just that it's going to be their success, it'll be your success as well. If you've empowered your subordinates to do a task that's for you, then that's your success as well. But also if they fail, it's your failure as well. So take that one.
Absolutely. I mean, accountability has to start from the top, and there's the hardest part is in particular is allowing others to be able to demonstrate some of that potential within them without people becoming competitive and thinking that it's them relinquishing any power or any of their own influence. And the best thing you can do and have to do is hold yourself and them accountable. If they don't rise to the occasion, then you have to hold them accountable. If they do, you have to reward them. And if they don't, you also have to place some accountability in that fact that you're not just putting them out there to sink or swim. You're out there to coach and mentor at the same time. And like you said, exactly, their failure is your failure. Their success is their success.
Yeah.
And you're then accountable to make sure that success is continued and passed on and perpetuated.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess talking about people who have got out and getting in touch with me. The very first reason I came across you as a personality was one of the guys reposted one of your posts about the Brereton report, and that's when I discovered you personally, and then what was going on in Australia with the Brereton report. And I guess on the back of that, you started up Voice of a Veteran. Would that be correct?
Yeah, well, so Voice of a Veteran, very quick story. In August of last year, I sort of had my own transition from the military, start of 2019, and I sort of went off the rails whereby I jumped into high-paying jobs and I jumped into popularity and things like that, and all the superficial things I needed in order to provide me with purpose. But I never realized that they gave me purpose that was myself instead of purpose outside of myself, which is what I needed. And at the same time, we've been going through a lot in Australia with this Brereton report. It's gone on for like 4.5 years. We've had sort of the seeds of doubt sown in not only our purpose of what we were doing in Afghanistan, but our purpose in supporting each other as people have been isolated and not allowed to talk to each other. During the conduct of this inquiry, we just have had the suicide rate and mental health decline rate within our veteran community climb so huge, whereas it's at above 700 veterans have committed suicide since 2011. I think last year alone was over 80 by the unofficial count, and that's still trickling in. So I got to a point in August of last year where I had my own first suicidal ideation. And it took me to a place whereby I was able to essentially establish a more mature understanding of my own mental health and suicide and everything else in between, and also snap out of the state that I perpetuated down to, which was a state of entitlement and a state of just being sad at not being my greatest, and asking and looking for others to solve my own problems, whereas I previously solved problems like I just spoke to you about beforehand. And it sort of snapped me into action, and I raised Voices of Veteran in order to provide me with essentially an identity through which I could start to put through and focus what needed to be done, and give myself the personal empowerment to do that, give myself a mission to be able to focus towards. And then fast forward 2 months to the 8th anniversary of the death of my guy, Scott Smith, in Afghanistan, 21st of October. And in the media here in Australia on that exact day, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, released this report that was from a US Marine who was in a Huey in helicopter support above us, saying that he heard a pop one night over the radio that was in parallel to some conversations talking about loadouts for taking detainees off target, where the number changed from 8 to 7, and made the deduction 8 years later that pop meant that we had executed someone, and came on saying that that was fact. And they actually named November Platoon, which had never really been ever done before. So by this time I just had a gutful. So I got on social media and called this out and said, hey, I'm actually the commander of November Platoon, and that's bullshit. And enough people caught on to that, got in contact with the TV stations. And next thing I was giving an interview, and that went on our national TV. And then fast forward another couple of weeks, the next thing, the Brereton report was released, and my name was probably the most recent talking about these things in Special Forces, as nearly everyone else is still serving and can't do so and whatever. And all of a sudden I was sort of the go-to guy to provide comment. And at the same time, at this time, I'd reconnected with a lot of my old community who were suddenly going through this huge uncertainty and questioning of their culture and their community and their identity. And really started to hit home at the heartstrings, just to see all of a sudden our senior leaders, our chief of our defence force, our chief of army, come out and start blaming the actions of 16 or 19 as being so bad that we're going to strip the honours and awards from 3,000 people that included 20 fallen heroes, that we're going to disband a squadron 7 years after the last time we deployed to Afghanistan, a squadron that had been in existence since the Vietnam War. And I just started to see leadership at the top level that was leadership by authority, leadership with entitlement, and leadership that stood against everything that I stood for as a leader, as I also watched it just abandon those who were literally those on the ground who I'd fought with and seen rise to their greatest, and everything else in between. So you can imagine it sort of all created the perfect storm, whereby I have just been reinstigated with a purpose to now finally be able to go back in and no longer have to demonstrate physical courage, but able to demonstrate moral courage to do what needs to be done by literally just speaking out authentically and with facts in support of the majority of my guys who are still serving, but also with a design purpose to then be able to help educate the Australian public who are now being forced to better understand what we did in Afghanistan, because also in doing so, we set the conditions for the current and future generations to potentially be better understood and to have less uncertainty and feel less isolated when they transition out of military into their civilian lives. So it's been a rapid 3 months, mate. But it's honestly, like I was saying, going from my lowest point where I was last August through to where I am now. I'm not all the way back there, but you can imagine like that. I haven't felt such a strong purpose in a long, long time.
Yeah.
And it's inspiring to be able to, and being privileged to be able to be in the position I am at the moment, waging whatever campaigns I can.
Damn. I didn't realize that about you. What was the catalyst that led you to having suicidal ideations, and was it your own self awareness that allowed you to snap out of it, like you mentioned, or was there an external factor that kind of helped you, realize that you were having these negative thoughts?
No, it's good questions, man. I actually last night I actually gave a presentation at one of our return servicemen's clubs here, where I actually just finally put together a presentation on this, and I'll do another one tomorrow night. And I've been able to, just like what I was saying to you beforehand about how the start of the bookend of my career in Special Forces was my selection course, and the end bookend was, running and redesigning that selection course and able to sort of trace back through attributes and actions and activities and events. I was able to do the same, tracing basically back to the greatest moment of my life, my career, my deployments in 2012, and who I was personally, professionally, what I saw around me, through to where I was in August at the lowest point, where I literally, the most logical thought in my head was that I had to remove myself from this equation for it to be fixed. That was the problem solved. And I have been able to, and this is this presentation that I'll show you sometime, that go back and track through the attributes that I had back at my greatness and the attributes that I had at my absolute lowest, and start to plot the paths in between. And, they also came from even my transition from the military. I took like nearly a year's worth of leave, and the actual physical exit from the military was me doing some box ticking. I somehow, even on my profile, had a waiver that I didn't need a psych screening. And it was just a comedy of errors that left me going, this is a fucking joke. We have a course for everything in the military. We don't have a course for transitioning. And I've done all these sorts of things, and all this stuff's on my file. And you think I don't even need a psych screening? I'm like, fuck off. You guys are just a joke. But anyway, I didn't care, because I'm going to get on with my life.
Yeah.
Through to our Department of Veterans Affairs, which is like the government organization that's designed to support with liability and compensation for injuries and stuff during service. Throughout, and this is the culture within our defense, and it is changing, but particularly within our special forces, I never ever went and got any of my injuries recognized. I completely snapped my patella tendon in 2014 and managed to avoid ever getting med downgraded or registering it. But then I had a piece of bone floating around in there that I needed a deliberate surgery to get done. And when I started to try and get that injury finally recognized after leaving service, it took 18 months for a doctor to pick up the same scan I had the day that I left the army, 18 months later, and say, I could do a 45-minute procedure to remove this bone and you can run again. Yeah. And so all these things are perpetuating to me feeling just like so devalued, coming from a place of greatness whereby I couldn't even achieve, basic survival stuff because I was putting an entitled trust in this system and an expectation for it to come to me and support me with what I needed was being let down. And when I couldn't find employment that actually provided me with professional purpose, I started chasing personal purpose. I started chasing superficialities like, drugs and alcohol in my relationship, in my life. Like throughout my entire military career, I had kept myself in the closet. I'm actually gay, but I never was defined by that and was never comfortable with that myself. And when I left the military, I actually, finally had a boyfriend and stuff like that. Yeah. And I thought that all these superficial things are things that I needed, but all they ever did was provide me with extrinsic motivations and temporary satisfactions. But there was no fire, there was no purpose inside. And then all of a sudden that form of fire and purpose inside, that was the missions that we did overseas and the men that I did those missions with, started to come under attack. And it started to come under attack in the public as stuff was being released to the public with this report. I started hearing, everyday Australians who previously had no idea and still didn't even know what we actually did. They just knew that whatever we did, we didn't do it the right way, which was completely wrong, which hadn't even held up to an investigation. It was still an inquiry that wasn't even released. And I wasn't even hearing anyone of our military leaders coming out and defending that simple fact, through to them watching guys that I'd previously seen be, absolute warriors, be the most magnificent versions of themselves, running into them. And, they've put on weight. You can see that they're not even maintaining eye contact. They're starting to, the shell on the outside is starting to waver, let alone what's on the inside is starting to decay because they're declining in their emotional and mental state by all this and everything else that's going on. So, and then, mate, on that late August afternoon, I was actually sitting on my couch at home and I got a phone call from a guy who told me that a soldier that I was previously the commander of had tried to kill himself by overdosing on prescription medication and had done so with his infant child also there, just in another room, not within visual. and had been found by his partner. An intervention had occurred and he was fine. But, I finished that call and I sort of sat there with all those external factors that were already making me feel devalued, that I was well aware I was over-reliant on superficialities and extrinsic motivators to get me through. And truly, this was another sort of dagger to that intrinsic motivation, that internal purpose that I had. And I started to really think about what that guy must have thought, and it must have been very similar to what I was feeling with all those external and internal factors. And then I started to problem solve, and I started to think, how can we get enough attention? This time it was already recorded that over 500, nearly 600 veterans had committed suicide. But I started to be maneuverist in my problem solving. I'm like, well, no special forces officers have killed themselves. And this might sound weird, but, particularly at the top levels of this, they're all ex-generals, they're all ex-whatever. There is a profile piece that, a lot of people by that time had engaged with me in social media, and even being gay or whatever, I was breaking down stereotypes, and there's an image and there's a status and there's a whatever that achieves a cut through. So I was like, right, well, I need to be the next person to go, and I need to be the last person to go, and I need to do this in a way that gets enough attention so people realize, like, it's not PTSD bubbling away in me. It's literally this process that you've taken me on the last 18 months and what you're continuing to expose my guys to. And it's not me trying to sound romantic or samurai or anything, but for that moment of logic, and whether it was a couple of minutes or whatever, the most logical thing in my head was that I had to kill myself. And I wrote a letter that I wanted to get to one of our senators to read out in front of our parliament. I knew where I had prescription medications, Valium, in the cupboard, and I literally had my mind set that this was going to occur, making sure who would find me. So my sister didn't find me, all this good stuff. And the most cliche part is that it was approaching about 5 o'clock when this occurred. And I had an 18-month-old mini dachshund sausage dog who then literally came up and just put his head on my lap and started nudging me because it was his time to get fed. And, people say dogs have that level of intuitive and all that. But what it was all of a sudden something else needed me. There was another purpose outside of self. This beautiful little creature needed me to feed him. And all it took was that sort of split second snap out of, the only thing that I can achieve my purpose was there was another small purpose over here that needed me. And I sort of sat there for another minute, and next emotions were I was just so disappointed and embarrassed, because then logic came back in. It's like, you're a fucking idiot, what is this going to achieve? Yeah. I previously had a relationship with suicide whereby I'd lost one of my soldiers who took his own life on our deployment in East Timor in 2007. And I was 22, and I thought that, things like suicide were predisposed. People were born with these issues, or, something happens in their childhood, or all of a sudden there's like a traumatic event that rewires the brain. And I'd finally been taken to a place whereby it was so logical to me that that's what wanted to occur. And I actually got really mad with myself, thinking about how much I would have disappointed my mum, my sister, even my bloody dog. But then all of a sudden, in the next breath, I looked at the note that I was writing, and I was like, mate, you have given that many brilliant orders groups and done that much brilliant planning throughout the years, that if you can't be the person to read this out to the parliament and take people along this journey that actually really got you to this point, then who else is going to do it? Because the saddest thing about all these suicides is that they're lag indicators, and what's happening is all these poor families are the ones trying to represent the potential feelings and emotions and journeys their loved one went on. And the best thing I could do with this profile that I thought could achieve cut through in the news, simply as being a statistic as a suicide, could actually be to put it to use and put every ounce of my former military, infantry and commando training to use, and assembling the best team and people that I could to actually, disrupt this mental health crisis, do what my 1-1 did, and just get out there and do what needs to be done to disrupt what's going on and to achieve the strategic requirement that is taking on and supporting our veterans and our guys, and changing the system and doing whatever is necessary to achieve what needs to be done. So, mate, that's where I'm at right now. And unfortunately, the Brereton report has taken over, but the Brereton report has really magnified, and this is the part of the narrative I'm trying to tell the Australian people, is that the Brereton report has really highlighted and magnified the callousness of some of the actions by our senior hierarchy in making aggressively assertive and overly authoritative decisions without considerations of the second and third order effects, without the considerations of the physical and mental health and well-being of those that it affects. We saw that manifest explicitly when our Chief of Defence Force stood up and said that he was going to request the categorical revoke of the meritorious unit citation from every member of the Special Operations Task Group, and not even realise, care, let alone acknowledge that this included 20 fallen heroes whose families were there watching this and had already given all that their family possibly could with the loss of their loved ones. And that he, as our senior general, let alone the politician he's trying to be and is posturing himself as, didn't even engage with things like the mandated support systems like our Department of Veterans Affairs to ensure that someone was there contacting those families so that they were not, their emotional trauma was not reopened by his statements in front of the Australian media, let alone the world.
And I've been tracking this, and I guess they were aware of the final, report about 6 months prior to making a televised announcement. So it's not as if they didn't have opportunity. So, they could have, had all that time to meet one by one with each individual family and say, look, this is what we're planning to do in the future. Like, we want to talk with you previously out of respect for, your loved one. We want to do it out of respect, But they didn't. You kind of just threw it on the nation. And it all comes down to what you said earlier on is it's just weak leadership. And you know what it's become, and this is another...
It's lazy. Yeah. It's lazy leadership. It's not just weak leadership. These guys have no issues. They're textbook narcissistic. They have no issues doing the hard yards. What they're doing is actually just being lazy, mate. And they're just defaulting to authority because no one is challenging them.
It's another phrase I've kind of cottoned onto as well, is that all these generals are now becoming more politician-like characters rather than being an actual military leader. They're playing the politics game and signaling their virtue to what they deem to be the most popular mindset audience in the nation. Well, I'm from fucking Scotland. I've never been to Australia, but I know for a fact that Australians are hard enough to fucking take the facts of a report and deal with it themselves. They don't need some fucking pussy general telling them, we're doing this, we're stripping all these guys because they're all fucking evil. No. Lay out the facts. Let the fucking public make their own mind up about it. And I guarantee the most common answer would be like, look, if you're fucking murdering people, we don't accept it. But for everyone else that wasn't involved with that, we 100% support you. And that's what it comes down to.
Absolutely.
In my mind, and I'm sure that's just common sense.
We're in a democracy like you guys, mate. And the biggest shockwave has been that the Australian public has caught on to, like, this was an inquiry. It wasn't an investigation. It's not even enough evidence to take it to court. Now they're stepping up an investigation to do that. So all of this heartache has come from stuff that doesn't even hold up to a day yet in court. And that's been the most terrible part. We could probably accept if it was the end of an investigation and these guys are now going to be charged, but no one's been charged. No one's been given a day in court, and we're already punishing everyone. There's nothing more undemocratic that we've ever seen in our modern generation.
Well, in the UK, we've got an issue with historic allegations. There's an actual, team for it. They're called the IHAT, Iraqi Historic Allegations Teams. And basically what their job is to go around and look for instances where, soldiers might have performed out with the remits of the law of armed conflict and chase them down and, prosecute them through the courts. It happened to one of the guys here. He was involved, a pretty famous battle of Danny Boy in Iraq, and he ended up, him and his section, fucking assaulting a position and bayoneting a bunch of guys, a bunch of Iraqis. And then, this is like a serious, like, fucking assault on a position. So the realities of war the realities of war are that is pretty fucking gruesome. And so now this poor guy and his family's been dragged through the ringer. And for the actual event that happened, he actually won the military cross for that event. So it's not as if it's like inconsequential, act. It's a real fucking reality of war. And anyway, the poor guy and his family were dragged through the courts, and got to the point where he literally could have been put away for life for doing his job that he was awarded, the military cross for doing, as the ground commander for that team. It's just like, and there's been many instances of that, even going as far back as like 40, 50 years, chasing guys from Northern Ireland who are involved in the Bloody Sunday events back in the day. So it's like they're chasing them when these guys are like 70, 80 year old, taking them through the courts 3-4 times. But I think recently they've just made legislation where they're stopping all that. It's going to be illegal to track soldiers down for doing that, and if they're not,
it's like some 7-year what's it called, statutory of limitations or something
like that. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Like if it's not brought up immediately, then
I'm all for accountability where accountability is due. What unfortunately we're seeing now, and I've lost the trust in, is people and their ability to understand the true context through which that content or those incidents occurred. And that's why we're looking at things so one-dimensionally, if anywhere even close to two-dimensionally, as far as looking at that physical terrain, but it's the psychological, it's the emotional. We're talking about counterinsurgency. We're talking about so many other elements that aren't portrayed in video footage, that aren't portrayed in pictures, that aren't portrayed even in stories. I had to give evidence twice, and they're asking me stories on missions of over 8 years ago. And I'm like, look, guys, one huge part for me, mate, was that we went out on every single mission we went out on the ground with, we had to take the Afghan partner force. And tragically, when we withdrew from Tarin Kowt, every single one of the partner force that I was with in 2012 were executed by the Taliban. Where's the strategic accountability from our government for that? But let alone throughout all those years that we're out with them on the ground, where are all the reports from them about the war crimes that were conducted by Australians against their own people? Because we were there on the ground in support of them. And that doesn't mean that some of this stuff didn't occur. And I don't know, it has to go through the proper legal process. And are there questions and conversations whereas, well, were some of these things that are alleged potentially even acceptable given the nature of the actual law over there and the actual situation over there and the actual requirements of counterinsurgency and the way in which operations were conducted, let alone in order to do so with second and third order effects, like I spoke to you about, setting the conditions for the future generations, like we were able to do positively in East Timor, also in Afghanistan, deterring the next generation from ever, sort of engaging in insurgent or terrorist activities again. We were listening into the bad guys and their leaders and their handlers back in other countries talking about, our individual unit insignia, and how we wore our night vision goggles, and the fact that the Australians had beards, and you'd hear stories like, oh, don't go into that area, that's where the Australians are, go over into this area. It's like, hey, make sure you don't do this, or if you encounter these guys, do this. And the fact that we actually had a reputation for being extremely effective at our role over there, that it even permeated up to the communications and command and control levels, clearly demonstrated that whatever the way in which we conducted ourselves was not only effective on the ground tactically, but was actually effective operationally and strategically up where it really mattered. And that was destabilizing insurgent networks and command chains in and outside of that country. So there's a lot of this information that unfortunately isn't good and doesn't make media grabs, because it is complicated and complex for Australians and the world to understand. But mate, my biggest part at the moment is trying to bring some of this to the forefront, because you can imagine, we need some more positivity in our media in general these days, let alone supporting our veterans, man. And we need to support having more great citizens joining our military forces and more of our military forces turning back into great citizens. And it starts with education and understanding. So, man, it's a long path, eh?
You mentioned earlier on as well about your personal dealings with mental health issues, and you mentioned that there's a mental health crisis within the veteran community in Australia. What do you think? From your meetings with people throughout, engaging in public public setting or even on television or whatever. What do you think the average Australian opinion is of what their soldiers have been through, and how much awareness of the issues that potentially could come on their shoulders do you think is there for them?
Mate, I was initially so afraid that the narrative that was being portrayed in our media was going to be the narrative that the Australian public grabbed onto, and that comes from a place of speaking with my grandfather who came back from the Vietnam War, and here our Vietnam veterans were, spat on and burned their uniforms, and he spent many years, decades never talking about it, and I was so fearful and made comments of the fact that I was speaking out because there was no way I was letting that happen to my guys, because without that identity and without that community, that's where too many just slip off into the darkness and they're never seen again. But mate, the Australian public is smarter than most politicians and media give them credit for. And they are more inspired by the pillar that is our Defence Force and the people who defend our country and carried forward. We talk about the Anzac spirit dating back to our days in Gallipoli. And the public response has been overwhelming, mate. And it has really helped to dissipate any fears I had that this would be seen to shed and indeed have the task stick to tarnishing the many for the sake of the few. And when I say for the sake of the few, I now talk about for the sake of the few and the actions that have been demonstrated by those senior generals that have not demonstrated Anzac spirit, have not demonstrated our core values. And the Australian publicly has immediately identified that and does not engage with and identify with them, and they have been found wanting. And it has been so heartening to really actually see this whole situation provide an opportunity for more Australians to better understand what we did in Afghanistan, what we better did, or what we understood, better understanding of who our veterans are and what they do, but also to really, outside of Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, demonstrate a very strong rising of the dormant support that is there for our servicemen and women. And also, even within the veteran community, it's really helped to bring it together and span a lot of bridges across some of these previous demographics and age demographics between Vietnam veterans and whatnot, because, when one of us is under attack, we're all under attack. And that's when we all come together and we all fight back stronger than anything else you've ever encountered. And the Australian people are right there, and they have our backs and they have our support, and they're being vocal about it. So, mate, it is watching this report be released by our generals and by our politicians was the point that made me feel the most disgusted to call myself an Australian, let alone a veteran. But the response by the Australian people and by those veterans who are joining in this has made me more proud than ever to be an Australian and to be a veteran. So it's been terrible to start and a great way, and the strength is just growing, mate. We're just getting started. Yeah,
exactly. And what do you personally, or what does the system in general have ongoing for the future in terms of making change?
Yeah, mate. Well, so the key part that now, with Voice of a Veteran, and it comes back to that moment I had sitting on my couch about fuck it, I should be the one reading this, not anyone else. So that campaign line is taking control of the veteran narrative. I'm sick of people talking about us, be they talking about us in an inquiry, talking about us in the media. It's time for veterans to take control of our narrative and to help educate the Australian public to better understand us and to help each other feel more understood, feel more relevant and more engaged. And then it's setting apart, activating that veteran community to take control of solving their own problems, particularly within our mental health and our recovery system and our transition system. We've become overly reliant on waiting on government departments or ex-service organisations and charities and all this to provide us with what we need. It's time to take control of ourselves, to remove that expectation and a weight from others to solve our own problems and re-empower ourselves to do things. And again, joining together as teams is doing that. And then, mate, and particularly this is my part here, linking in with as many power players as I can to then take those fixes up to a systemic level and start to bring about change in those government agencies, those policies within the Defence Force itself. And you can imagine a lot of this is actually really just talking about cultural change. letting our senior leaders and those future senior leaders know that their actions are going to be held accountable regardless of what rank they have, because every Australian is a voter and we will act in accordance with what we believe and know is morally right and democratically right. And we will no longer remain silent in doing so. And we are also smart enough and adaptable enough to bring together people and bring together projects to affect and create change at every level. Because again, the last thing that I finally realized, and it takes me back to those Papua New Guinea insertion days, is that why not? Exactly. Why not? And too often in my spiral to misery to that time in August, the why not was simply me being the only person holding myself back, because I adopted a mindset of entitlement as opposed to responsibility. And I was allowing and waiting for others to solve problems that I could find ways to do. So it's, mate, the grand scheme of things, it's all about mindset. It's all about cultural change. But there are some small objectives along the way that we can help to make sure that we don't only fix the problem, but actually remove it completely from the orbit.
Well, yeah, like your personal story is fucking very inspiring, and I think you should be really proud of what you and the your supporters are doing for veterans in Australia. And it does transcend into other nations. I'm following you from the UK, so I'm sure there's people following you from all over, so it does transcend international borders. But I think you should definitely be very proud of the fact that you are making actual change to people, to help people's lives, and that's something that's you can't put a price on that.
No, that's it, mate. That's the primary inspiration right now. And you know what? The best part about all of this, for better or for worse, is that it's occurring in this coronavirus post-2020, now 2021 world, where we are actually so isolated internationally. Australian borders aren't going to probably be open for another year, things like this. So, you know what? It's time to sort out our own backyard, because like you said, mate, this and these stories aren't the first that they've ever happened in the Western veteran society, let alone in the world. And it's not going to be the last time. And, our great alliances, our Five Eyes alliances with the UK, the US, Canada, New Zealand, here in Australia, we have to start working together as an international community, as a veteran community as well. So we need to sort our own backyard out, and then also learn and make sure that these incidents and situations don't happen again, but then also be ready to support each other, mate, and take our lessons learned to help others, and get told to fuck off in Scottish or Celtic or whatever you people say, but at least be there and be ready and be willing to support our international community once we sort our own backyard out first. And that's 2021. That's our priority.
Yeah, that's good. We're just going to probably wrap up here just now, but what piece of advice would you look back to your 18-year-old self and lay on thick to that person?
Authenticity and leadership by example. I spent so much time looking to others, as we naturally do, to try and see what part of them I wanted to replicate to be myself. And all that ever did was create uncertainty, because I never lived up to that. And just appreciate that the best thing you can do is go through and lead by an example that you'd be happy to follow, and keep your eyes and ears open along the way, and just really discover who your authentic self is.
And then just in closing, then, what would your final thoughts be over your whole time served and then post military career as well?
Shit. Quick summary of your entire life.
Pride.
Shit. I don't know, mate. Quick summary of my life. I was able to be my best because I worked with some of the best. I am my best when I'm around others who are also their best. And it's so important for me to move forward, appreciating that I need others to help me be great, and I need others to help me be accountable and be selfless. And to also appreciate the number one thing that I also need is a true and authentic purpose. I need a reason why. Yeah. And that reason why has to be more than me. It has to be more than survival. It has to be for a greater cause. And that might make me constantly pursuing something for the rest of my life. But doing so with the best team supporting me and me supporting them and being responsible and accountable to them is what brings out the best in me. So
that's a good way to close out. But let me just say once again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening to sit down and spread the word. A lot of guys do get a lot from these long form discussions, and absolutely, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time.
Mate, thank you so much for doing this. A huge part that I've also realized is as a part of my therapy, part of my treatment, a part of my self-development is just talking and having these conversations. We talk so much about mental health, but for me, mate, this is a mental fitness session. I've literally just done like a 2.5 hour workout with you. And as opposed to saving up for my therapist once a week, like they're my mental health sessions. This is mental fitness, mate. You and I just having these clear and authentic conversations, helping me build pathways, helping me listen to you as well and putting it out there so others can hear it. And you're the one who's sitting there, going out there first and being proactive and having these conversations. So, mate, thank you for what you're doing for not only me, for not only you, but for our communities combined. So my thanks to you, mate.
Well, cheers, mate. But yeah, thanks. Have a good night, mate. Take care.
Good.